I thought I knew love. I thought I knew her. But everything was a lie. Just days after we got engaged, she slept with another man, right after telling me she'd wait until our wedding night. My world crumbled. 15 years of friendship, of love, destroyed in one moment of betrayal. She handed me our ring, a symbol of our future, and I realized she had given another man a larger diamond. I was nothing but a shadow in her past. Now, I'm about to make sure she becomes nothing but a shadow in mine. April 1998. Jack loved Janice. It was strange. Janice called and said they needed to talk soon, using her soft voice she used when something was very serious. They were engaged to be married. Just 2 months earlier, he had asked her, and they had gone ring shopping together that night. They picked a ring, but it was a bit too loose. They made it fit just right, and she left with it on her finger. They went to show their parents with pride. Jack had known Janice since they were in first grade. They often shared classes, cheered for each other at sports events, and watched recitals. She was the second best student in their senior year, and he earned a scholarship from the Marines. He had always loved her, and everyone thought they would marry someday after college. Her parents encouraged this, and his just nodded and smiled. Now, they were seniors in college. They cared about saving their first time for their wedding night. She wanted that special moment just for them. The ring they picked showed everyone what they both felt. Jack loved Janice, and Janice loved Jack. On that April day, they met under the oak tree in her backyard. Her parents had set up chairs and a small table. The warm spring sun made the place feel peaceful and calm. They often gathered there with her family to share drinks, light firecrackers on the 4th of July, or talk about different topics like politics or baseball. This afternoon, it was just Janice and him. They had a month and a half until graduation, she from the University of Cincinnati and he from Miami. Different colleges were tough, but she had only lived on campus this 1 year, and he was only a half-hour drive from home. He thought everything was working out. They planned to marry 2 weeks after graduation, and he would begin his duty at Quantico in July. They had a simple honeymoon planned. Janice looked at him and took a deep breath. I have something to say, and it's hard. He felt a tightness in his chest, worry and fear. I always said I wanted to save myself for our wedding night. We had so many chances, she said, holding his hand. They gazed out at her house from the little hill under the oak tree. Yeah, it wasn't easy, he replied, smiling. Have you changed your mind? We still have time. But she shook her head. She wasn't suggesting anything different. I have let you down, Jack, she said, almost in a whisper. I have let you down. What do you mean? He asked, confused. Each time she said, let down, she squeezed his hand tightly. Is it about school? I knew you had trouble with that teacher, but... No, not school. I was with someone, Jack. A guy from college. He had expected something serious, but not this. To her, saving herself had been a sign of purity, of love, and all the good things a man and woman could share. He had always followed her rules and even accepted them during summer activities with his Marine friends when he was away from home. He had stayed loyal to a woman who wouldn't share close moments with him, yet wouldn't marry him, yet, and wouldn't live with him, yet. He had chosen to have a second beer on a cruise 2 summers ago instead of spending time with another woman at a bar in South Korea. He could have been with her then and at other times, but he didn't. Janice wanted them both to wait until they were married to explore their feelings together. They had kissed and touched, hoping to ease their desires, but it only made it harder to resist. They agreed that it wasn't the right time. Now she spoke softly. I met him in class last November, and I fell in love, Jack. I loved him even though I cared for you for so long. But he was tall and dressed nicely, and he took me to games and events. She paused to take a deep breath. I was with him 2 months ago, just once. But then it happened again the Saturday you went on that Marine trip, and I realized I loved him too. His world shattered. He felt a heaviness in his chest he had never felt before, pushing against his heart and lungs. 2 months ago? Was that before or after I gave you the ring? She looked down, looking guilty. The next night, then she reached into her pocket, took out something and handed it to him. He looked down and saw a diamond engagement ring on her left hand, much bigger than the one they had picked together just a month ago. He stared at the ring in his hand. "You were engaged to two men at the same time?" he asked, shocked, shaking his head. She looked away. "I know I haven't treated you well, Jack. I do care for you. But Kevin is the man I always wanted. You belong to my past, while he's meant for my future." Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had prepared them ahead of time. He focused on her, holding back his emotions. He thought about all the times she had told him she loved him over their 15 years as friends and companions. He remembered the fun things they did together, building snow forts, pulling a thorn from her leg, her holding a snake to show him, playing baseball, and having tackle football games with others in the mud. He thought about her white dress at their confirmation, prom nights, and sharing meals in the cafeteria, all the things friends and lovers do. A tightness grew in his chest. He had truly loved only her for so long. Now that love was changing, and he would have to carry that heartache with him forever. He stood up. "Yes, I see it now. I've been fooled." He walked away from her, even as she called after him, wanting to say more. With the ring still clutched in his damp hand, he left. He only saw a straight road in front of him for the next few minutes. He drove around Sky Gray, feeling dazed and lost. He focused hard on the road, the cars, and the people walking by. Tired of that, he went home and talked to his mom. She called his dad, who came home to be with them. His dad, a big, serious man who had always cared for Janice, shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He felt like he didn't understand anything anymore. Jack without Janice felt impossible. Then the phone rang and Jack's mom picked it up. She spoke softly for a few minutes, then came back into the room. "That was Marge," she said, referring to Janice's mother. "Janice is expecting a baby." Jack's parents stared at him, but Jack just shook his head. "No, it's not mine. She was with someone named Kevin." He stopped and looked at his parents. "I feel so foolish." February 2001. SEAL Squad Unnumbered. "Lieutenant, we are reviewing your service record." Leslie stood straight in front of a table with Marine Colonel Samuel LaJoy, Rear Admiral Elias Jansen, who preferred the title Commodore, and Navy Captain Juanita Estevez sitting across from him. Documents were spread out on the table. He glanced down to see several pictures of himself, one formal portrait and several showing him in action from various training programs. Because of his last assignment overseas, his service time had been extended from 4 years to 6. He had spent almost 3 years in training since joining the Corps. He didn't mind the extra years. He had no other commitments, no wife, no kids, and after college, he focused completely on his training. He had gone home a few times, but most of his free time was spent reading books about military tactics, novels, and articles on foreign affairs. "Do you have a personal life, Lieutenant?" the captain asked. "Ma'am," he replied, confused. "What do you like? You don't seem to have close friends or a girlfriend. You only see your parents in Ohio sometimes. Are you distant from them?" the colonel explained. "We have no reports about your social life. The Israelis say you spend your free time reading and writing, but only talk to family. We want to understand you better." "Oh, yes, sir. I had a girlfriend for a long time, but she married someone else right before I started training, so I guess the Marines became my focus. Then I volunteered for an exchange program before finishing my last course, and it changed things a bit. That training was hard. I did make some friends and went on a date now and then, but I always felt like the American who would leave eventually. I wanted to learn as much as I could. I knew I had a special chance. I learned to scuba dive and skydive. I picked up reconnaissance techniques too, hand-to-hand combat, small weapons, rescuing hostages, sneaking in, and taking out targets." "So," said the Commodore, "are you just military? We want to know if you can work with SEALs. American SEALs are some of the best-trained soldiers. Some have families while others are planning for the future. How do you interact with people outside of your training? You haven't been to our SEAL school and don't know any SEALs, but Chayetet 13 holds a good reputation. Your performance was rated very high and you were praised by General Ari Lessoud. There's also a special note here from Lieutenant Colonel Naftali Meyer." "I wasn't aware of Colonel Meyer's note, but it's nice to hear. I thought she didn't like me," Leslie replied. Meyer had often frowned at him during his 6 months in Israel. He wasn't sure what her role was, but she always seemed to be watching. Yes, Colonel Meyer. A woman? I'm not familiar with Hebrew names. Speaks very highly of you, said Captain Estevez. She says you work well with people from different backgrounds, races, and beliefs. She noted an incident where you stopped a fight before it could escalate. Leslie smiled, recalling the moment. Yes, two groups were arguing passionately about how to handle terrorists. Many had family members hurt or killed in attacks. I wasn't known as an officer, so we were all treated equally. I managed to calm everyone down. I think it helped that I didn't have close ties with any of them. But they thought they knew me and recognized I was American. They assumed I was naive, and in this case, that worked in my favor. The captain and colonel shared a look, as if they had been discussing this before. The Commodore remained serious. Do you think an officer, even a second lieutenant, should keep some distance from the enlisted people? Captain Estevez asked. Yes, ma'am. I don't mean to avoid friendliness or caring for them. I believe in keeping a professional distance. It's important to work as a team, but it shouldn't feel like everyone has the same voice. Still at attention, Leslie wondered why. Usually, military officers were more friendly. We are thinking about assigning you not to Delta, as we originally planned, Lieutenant. This statement surprised Leslie as the Commodore was looking deeply into his eyes. Yes, the captain continued. There's a new SEAL team being formed for special missions. This team won't be stuck to a specific area, but will go wherever needed. It will be smaller and more independent, like the work you did in Israel. You'll be the second in command, under a Navy commander. And because of your strong performance, you are promoted. You are now Captain Leslie. The captain, commodore, and lieutenant colonel stood up, and the captain walked around the table. The lieutenant colonel handed her a small box. As Leslie stood still, she carefully took off his silver first lieutenant bars and put on the new double bars of a Marine captain. Congratulations, Captain, she said with a firm handshake. The Commodore and Lieutenant Colonel shook his hand too. They all returned to their seats. At ease. Leslie relaxed, placing his hands behind his back and standing with his feet apart. But most of your experience is in schools, the Colonel continued. That gives you what? 2 ribbons on your chest? Oh, and the one from Israel. These guys can tell combat ribbons from others. You'll be looked at differently, Captain, and you are not a SEAL. They won't understand how someone who isn't a SEAL can lead a SEAL team. That's a big gap. Leslie's heart raced a little. He had been a first lieutenant for almost a year, but it was rare to be promoted to captain so quickly. What do you think, Captain? The Colonel asked. I thought you were going to send me to brag with Delta. Where will I be going with the SEALs? He wondered. First to Little Creek, where you'll train with your SEAL team. You'll practice different scenarios like hostage rescues, getting people out under fire, night drops, and halo jumps. Rappelling, too. But mainly it's about working together. Shayatet does things differently, but we share the same principles, said the captain. Leslie smiled, then tried to keep a serious face. Something funny, Captain? The captain asked. More training, ma'am, he replied. She caught his smile and returned it. But this time you'll be training with the team you'll go into battle with, and it's just for 6 weeks. After that, we expect you to be assigned a ship. You'll most likely head into a conflict zone. We think war is coming, and it might not just be against the Taliban. It could be a new type of war, one without clear sides. Report tomorrow to Lieutenant Commander Luke Ormond, your commanding officer. Since the team includes someone who isn't a SEAL and comes from another organization, we'll call it SEAL Squad Detached. It's a tradition to call any SEAL unit a team, even though that might seem strange. Come back tomorrow and we'll have written orders ready. Have you seen your parents? Yes, ma'am, Leslie replied. I went straight from Israel to see them. I'm home for a week and ready to get started, ma'am. The training has been great, but I want to use what I've learned. The colonel and captain nodded. The Commodore kept a serious expression. They stood up. Good luck, Captain. Go find your new insignia. Congratulations, the captain said, extending her hand for a shake. Leslie took her hand and shook hands with the Commodore and the colonel as well. He noticed they had not followed normal military customs for the meeting, and he wondered why the SEAL Admiral had only observed. Thank you, ma'am and gentlemen, he said. He stepped back, turned around, and left. For a moment, they were silent. He certainly is calm, someone finally said. They all talk about it, said Lieutenant Colonel LaJoy. I hope he's as good in action. He's trained well enough, but does it really make sense to train someone so much just for one mistake to ruin it all? Captain Estevez said, shaking her head. I hope we don't face that. But it's always a risk, isn't it? Replied the Commodore, recalling friends he had lost. Come in, called a voice from behind the door. Leslie opened the door and stepped up to the desk where Lieutenant Commander Luke Ormond was sitting. Excuse me, sir. Captain Jacob Leslie is here as you ordered, he said. Ormond looked at his second-in-command, a tall, muscular man who had the build of a football player. He thought, how could this guy run 3 miles in 17 minutes? That time seems slow for someone like him. The run was dated 3 weeks ago. Maybe the watches are off in Israel, he thought. Relax, Captain. Congratulations on your promotion, by the way. Ormond stood up and shook his hand. Leslie replied, Thank you, sir, and returned to standing at ease. Please take a seat. Is it okay if I call you Jacob just between us? He asked. That's fine, sir, but my friends usually call me Jack. Leslie didn't ask to call him Luke, and Ormond liked that. Jack sat down, and the two officers looked at each other. Jack, it is. You've moved up fast. I didn't become a lieutenant until I was 28, Ormond said. Yes, sir, it's been surprising. So many courses, but no real time in the fleet. I've never been in action, sir, and it weighs on me. It has to mean something, Leslie replied. Are you worried about failing or making a mistake? Ormond asked. Yes, very much. The pressure in training is one thing, but when the bullets are flying and men rely on me, I want to do my job well, Leslie said. I understand, Ormond said, turning a page in the record. I see you're not married and have no kids. At 25, are you not interested in family? Leslie looked a bit uneasy. I do want a family, sir. I thought it would be a big part of my life, but it hasn't happened yet. I don't have a steady girlfriend or anyone right now. Do you have a family? He asked. I do, said Ormond, turning a picture on his desk to show Leslie. This is my wife, Julia, and our kids, Rose and Luke Jr. Leslie felt a brief flash of envy. You have a beautiful family, sir. Is Luke about 4? He is. He's starting T-ball this spring, Julia says. That's wonderful. A moment of silence followed. It's probably best not to rush into starting a family, Ormond suggested. Leslie smiled. I have no plans to make any quick decisions in that area, sir. Ormond nodded and put the record away. I will introduce you to the men today before our run and meal. You should say a few words. They won't fully understand what it means for you to be a Marine. I'm not sure about that. Maybe we should just leave it as is. Let them talk about it and figure it out on their own. Should I wear the Israeli SEAL badge? Maybe it's better to keep some mystery, Ormond said with a smile. He was concerned about Jack's age. Many of the other men were older. In this small and special group, he thought it best to have clear roles between the leaders and the team. Yes, sir, Jack replied. Then they discussed plans, deadlines, meetings, character traits, programs, and policies. Ormond wanted Jack's introduction to the team to go smoothly. He thought it should be calm, professional, and positive. Jack was young for a 2, and he was a Marine. The unit was unique, small with high ranks, meant to work in secret missions across borders that might not involve enemies. Ormond needed a 2 who could step up in a crisis. The senior enlisted member was experienced and very capable. Ormond intended to watch how they worked together closely. Leslie and Chief Ortiz needed to trust each other. September 2001, southern Syria, living in the Syrian desert, far from any town, made it hard for the Haddad family to make friends. They were staying away from neighbors and hoped no one noticed they had moved into the little house Mr. Aglai found for them. There was a field across the dirt path where Sarah could try to grow some vegetables if they stayed there long, but right now, they mainly wanted to escape. Jordan was not too far away, and neither was Israel. They had water, and Mr. Aglai visited them every week with some food until they could leave. Adnan thought about just leaving and trying to walk to the border, but Mr. Aglai warned that there were communities and some dangers in the way. Now that the baby was here, Sarah was busier taking care of the other 3 children most of the time. The baby fed, cried sometimes, and slept. The heat was fading as summer ended, but Rifat had no friends, just a few books he had finished and an old soccer ball. So Adnan played soccer with Rifat since he couldn't work because of the risks to Christians, and his family was Christian. Adnan kicked the ball over the rise of the hill, and Rifat chased after it. He quickly went out of sight. Rifat was fast, and Adnan believed he was smart. Suddenly, the ball rolled back over the hill right to Adnan, who caught it with his chest and dribbled it to the top. Rifat stood by two large rocks. Adnan passed the ball to him. Rifat stopped it with his chest, but it rolled into a small hole between the rocks, where Adnan couldn't see it. Rifat ducked between the rocks and, though he was almost hidden, he pulled the ball out, dropped it, and kicked it back to his father, laughing. The boy loved soccer. Someday Adnan hoped to find a team where Christian was not seen as an enemy. 3 days before their flight to the Mediterranean, Commander Ormond invited the whole unit to his home for a picnic. Leslie and the other members met Julia, his wife, and their 2 kids. The group loved to eat, and drinks were shared easily. The SEALs behaved well, watching their words, and everyone had a good time. Leslie enjoyed his talk with Julia, since it had been a year since he'd chatted with a woman close to his age. It was nice for the sailors to see their officers in a more relaxed setting. Only 2 of the enlisted men were married, and their families did not live near Little Creek, because the unit was new and often left quickly. A few days later, they were in the Mediterranean, on the amphibious assault ship Baton. From the flight deck, they could reach Israel in 5 minutes, Lebanon in 4, and Jordan or Syria in about 15. Leslie's worries about joining the SEAL unit faded during their second mission when they found a way into a basement. Leslie was in charge in the house they were searching, while Commander Ormond was watching from a distance. Leslie didn't want to send anyone into the dark space first because it was too risky. So he decided to go in himself. Expecting some pushback, he jumped down 8 feet into the basement with his gun ready. The room was empty, but it could have been a trap or a hiding place. On another mission, one of the soldiers, Bassett, broke his leg, and Leslie carried him for half a mile to safety. That was tough, but he didn't want the others to see he was struggling. Most complaints about the Marine officer disappeared after that. After climbing out of a hole, Varmint asked, "Are all Marines like you, sir?" With a small smile, Leslie replied, "No, some are shorter." After 8 months, the team had made it through many missions without losing any friends. There had been injuries, including one serious case, but no one died. New members joined, and like all military groups, the team kept going. With each new person, Ormond scheduled practices, classes, and drills to help everyone work together. He believed that each new person brought new energy to the whole team. The events of September 11th shocked America. It revealed a threat that had been hidden. The enemy could plan and work together, using our own way of life against us. Suddenly, a fight that had been kept quiet from our own people was brought into the open. On September 11th, everything changed. Within a month, America pinpointed bin Laden as the one behind the attacks. They issued an ultimatum to the Taliban in Afghanistan and readied for an invasion. Operation Enduring Freedom started in Afghanistan, but SEAL Squad Unnumbered had a different job, in southern Syria. This mission went mostly unnoticed by the world. When Lieutenant Commander Ormond got hurt, Leslie found himself leading the team. Their task was to rescue an old man who had somehow reached the U.S. authorities from the border region, a vast desert now in danger from a radical group. There were many reports of this group harming Christians and Jews. It was late afternoon, and they believed there were no Syrian troops nearby. The Jordanians were not interfering this time, and the Israelis were informed and willing to assist, given the political situation. Everything was going well until Commander Ormond was shot. He then passed command to Jack. The radical group spotted their helicopters and decided to shoot at them, arriving in numbers. 2 SEALs were hurt, but managed to move towards the landing zone with the old man, while the rest held back the attackers on a hill. The commander lay wounded on the wrong side of the crest, with just a rock shielding him from the attackers. He was alert but unable to move. He called Leslie over the radio to give an update. 2-6, Leslie heard on the radio. "I'm hit. Down. Behind that big rock. Can't move. You're in charge." Jack was ready to take action. 6 is down. 6 is down. On the radio but unable to move. Every team member heard Captain Leslie calmly say this, each word clear and steady. There was a moment of silence. "Is the old man safe?" Leslie asked, his voice calm and deep. Varmint, whose real name was Lansing, replied, "Yes, sir. The old man is safe and at the extraction point." Wounded? Leslie asked. Varmint answered, They're both able to move but not seriously hurt. They're at the extraction point and ready to go. Leslie took a moment to think and then said, Varmint, take the first helicopter. We can hold the attackers from the hill until help gets here. There was a pause. All of us, sir? Lansing asked, clearly concerned about leaving during an active fight. Someone has to go first, and you all are nearby. We'll send the second helicopter after. The Cobras will cover our exit. In about 2 minutes. Understood, Varmint said reluctantly. They were outnumbered, but the Cobras should turn the tide. The commander was stuck on the wrong side of the rocky hill. They were only a quarter mile from the evacuation, but the attackers were close by and seemed to have lots of ammo. Charlie, Butterfly, head to the top of the hill. Provide cover fire as soon as you can. Wait for my signal unless you see a clear shot. Roger? Yes, too, Charlie and Butterfly replied. Leslie continued, Montana can move with Hitter to the west side of the hill. Try to spot the first target. I'll go with Ranger to get 6. Ranger, you secure 6 while I cover. Are you with me, Ranger? Over? Yes, sir, I'm with you, said McAdam, known as Ranger, who was about 10 feet away. Charlie, Butterfly, get ready. Yes, too. Ready. There was a brief pause, a habit of Leslie's when he wanted everyone in sync before giving orders. Move! Instantly, Leslie and McAdam dashed for Ormond, rushing over the hill and catching sight of their commander behind a rock. Leslie fired at where he thought the enemies were, and as he got more certain, his aim improved. Meanwhile, Simpson and Plain provided cover from the hill to the south, shooting towards the enemies that posed a risk to their commander. Leslie figured Montana and Hitter were headed to the landing zone. Ormond had been hit in the leg, and it was injured badly. He was in a lot of pain, but thankfully there wasn't a lot of blood. Leslie and McAdam moved behind the rock to help him. Ranger wrapped a bandage above Ormond's knee and tied it tightly, though he still looked a bit unsatisfied, which was typical for him. McAdam, who was probably the strongest in the unit, lifted the smaller Ormond onto his back and spoke into his radio. Ready to... He sounded excited, but he remained calm. I hear the helicopters. Popping smoke. Leslie got up and threw a red smoke canister. Ready to move. He paused. Go! Leslie started firing through the smoke where he had seen movement, while McAdam ran forward to the top of the hill, and Plain and Simpson fired rapidly to protect them. Leslie and McAdam, carrying Ormond, made it over the ridge and out of immediate danger. We're over. Charlie, Butterfly, if you have a target, shoot it in the next 5 seconds, then head to the extraction point. Ranger with 6 was still rushing down towards the landing zone. Yes, sir, Leslie heard, followed by a rapid succession of gunfire as they sprinted down the hill. Leslie was in touch with the Cobras on the radio. He tossed another red smoke canister to the hilltop. Enemies are just east of my smoke. Roger, I see your red smoke. That's us. Keep them at bay, please. Got it. Hold tight, folks. I'm sorry. We're busy moving down here. Good luck, ma'am. He smiled at that as he listened to the sound of the Cobra's guns firing. Bump! 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 Leslie caught up with McAdam with about 200 meters to go to the extraction point. He noticed Charlie and Butterfly keeping pace with them to his left. Ranger, pass me your gear and cover us. Yes, sir. McAdam was short on energy, weighed down by weapons and gear, plus carrying Ormond. Ormond's eyes were tightly shut from pain and blood loss, but Leslie believed he was still aware. Luke, it's Jack. I've got you now. Jack, that really hurts. Thump, thump, thump. Leslie called out to Varmint. Varmint, how are our guys doing? Horse got hurt in the upper arm and Crate's side got hit too, but he's not bleeding much too. Ormond was listening to the conversation. Good job, Roger, Leslie said. He was jogging next to McAdam, carrying Ormond like a fireman would. Boarding now, Varmint replied. A moment later, an old Huey helicopter took off with half of his men, the older man, and especially the 2 who were hurt. Ortiz waited at the pickup point. He never left until the last soldier was on board. Montana and Hitter got on the first chopper, Ortiz said. Another Huey landed just as they got to the field. The attack helicopters were still flying above, but they didn't have any targets left. Leslie helped the commander into the helicopter. Simpson, Charlie, and Plain, Butterfly, were already on board. McAdam was sweaty from the run with the 6, and Ortiz and Leslie were also dripping with sweat. The Huey took off, the rotor blades spinning as they flew out of southern Syria. 20 minutes later, they were on the USS Baton, floating on calm waters. It was soon dark, and the moon shone down on them. 14 years later, May 2015, a good day for a ball game. It was Saturday morning in May, the kind of day that made you wonder why anyone would live in Ohio. The sun was shining, there was a nice cool breeze, and fluffy white clouds made the blue sky more beautiful. Jack Leslie's right leg hurt, reminding him of choices he made long ago. It also reminded him that he had to get up. His leg ached every morning until he got moving, but that first step was tough. What was easier to deal with was that his 13-year-old daughter was sitting on the edge of the bed, almost tickling his foot. He opened his eyes to see her finger just inches from the bottom of his foot. "I'm not touching you," she said with a grin. "You know that drives me crazy," he replied. "Not touching your foot," she insisted. "No, you're not," he responded, thinking for a moment before deciding to move. He pulled his foot away and quickly turned, grabbing Hattie, tickling her and tossing her onto his pillows as she squealed with laughter. She was much more ticklish than he was, and sometimes she just wanted to play this tickling game to connect. They were both in their pajamas. Hattie was strikingly beautiful, with long, thick, black, wavy hair that was a little messy, dark eyebrows, and bright blue eyes that stood out. She was small and slim, and Jack often wondered how she could pitch a baseball so well with those thin arms. She looked Middle Eastern because she was half, and people commented about that sometimes. She was the fastest runner in her 8th grade class, especially in short races, and that included the boys. Jack hadn't seen her get in trouble for stealing in years. Last summer, she had surprisingly stolen a base, then another, all the way to home plate, helping her team win a game in the last moments. "So what's going on, kiddo?" Jack asked. "I'm almost in high school, Dad," she replied, hoping for more. He smiled back. "But not just yet. Not yet." She really wanted Jack to share the whole story of how he had adopted her. She'd been asking about it for months. For some reason he wouldn't explain. He always said he would tell her once she got to high school. She still had a month left in 8th grade, a summer filled with baseball, and then he would decide. He wanted her to know the story, but he had a reason for waiting until high school. He thought she'd be better able to understand it then. The story was tough and emotional. Her grandparents, Uncle Craig and Aunt Lisa, knew all about it, but no one else did. She had always understood that Jack had adopted her and that something sad had happened to her birth family. But that was it. Jack wanted her to be old enough to hear that difficult story, and he hoped to have the right moment, with his parents there to help her cope with any sadness. She would turn 14 in September and begin at Merciful Savior School in the fall. "Merciful Savior let their softball coach go after that letter to the editor came out," she said, trying to change the topic. "Is that so? I hadn't heard. I guess the coach didn't stop the bad stuff. Sharon wouldn't fire someone without giving them a fair chance." "Maybe you can play there next year after all," Jack replied. It seemed the coach had the girls standing too close to the plate and positioning themselves to get hit by the pitches. One girl even broke her arm, despite wearing an elbow guard, and the umpire still called it a strike. The umpire later wrote a detailed letter to the editor about all the unsafe actions he'd seen from coaches over the years, naming names, schools, and events. Many of those coaches had retired, but some, like the one from Merciful Savior, were still coaching. Sharon Martin, the principal at Merciful Savior, was a friend of Jack's, and he wasn't surprised she or the athletic director let the coach go. After Jack returned from the war, he had applied for a teaching job at Savior, but since the public school offered more money, he took that. He later became friends with Sharon when he asked her to join his doctoral committee. "Yeah, the ump who wrote that letter got suspended as an official. I read that in the paper today," Hattie said. Jack shook his head. Hattie rolled over and pulled the covers over herself. "Who's coaching the team for the rest of the season?" he asked. A Mrs. Rinker, a teacher there. The assistant coach isn't a teacher and can't make it to all the games on time because of her job. The paper just said Mrs. Rinker played in college and has coached younger girls in Greenville. Well, we'll see if she comes back next year. Those parents aren't very generous since the old coach won the state title a few years ago. I never heard he had girls doing that, though. I think he just started when he saw another team doing it, and the umpires always let the kid go to first base." Jack shook his head. I guess this ump was different. Yeah. When's your game? I need to be there at 11. The game starts at noon. Are you pitching? Yep. Tanya says she doesn't like pitching, so the coach said I'd pitch all the games except for a doubleheader. Jack shook his head. And you say your arm doesn't get sore? Nope. If it ever does, I'll let you know, but I'd rather pitch with it sore than not play or not do as well. Jack said, I always had a sore arm after 6th grade, always. But I wasn't a pitcher. Jack stood up, feeling a sharp pain in his right thigh, but it went away as he hobbled to his dresser, his right hip stiff. We'd better get dressed and head out. Myers for breakfast? He asked. Yeah, that's almost a pre-game ritual on Saturdays, isn't it? She replied. Not too bad as long as you don't order greasy food. At 11 o'clock, he dropped her off at Merciful Savior High School for her game. This was the only game of the year held at a high school field, and the girls were excited. Jack limped over to the stands behind home plate while Hattie went through the fence to the dugout. Merciful Savior had dugouts built into the ground, so people could see the field better from behind them. Most high schools had dugouts above ground that blocked the view. The field looked great, but the outfield wall, bleachers, and dugouts were very old and worn down. Having almost an hour to spare, Jack walked around the athletic fields in the school because his injured leg wouldn't allow him to jog. It was always a challenge to keep his weight down since he couldn't run. He rode, lifted weights, rode his bike, and swam, but running was painful, and he often felt weak in his right leg. It would never be right. So he walked. By the time he finished the mile around the school grounds, the game was about to start. He noticed Sharon Martin, about 50, with gray hair, thin and quite smart, sitting alone in the stands. She practically lived at her school. He decided to join her. Hello, Sharon. I've seen you in the paper a lot recently. She shook her head, and he knew that no matter how much he asked, she wouldn't share anything important. Hello, Jack. How's the book selling? You mean Mary? Very well, my publisher says. Jack had 3 books still on the shelves, a history of racist literature, which was his dissertation from 6 years ago, and 2 novels. Mary's Mind was currently on many bestseller lists as a hardback. He had quit his teaching job when his first novel, Caleb and the Colonel, was published. Sharon thought about why he left his job. Maybe he didn't want to teach anymore, or maybe he knew some parents wouldn't like the mature scenes in his book. He claimed the story was based on real people and that those scenes were real, even if he admitted to making up a lot of the details. Still, she noticed he seemed happy and was driving a new car, so he must be doing okay. He asked Sharon, You found a new coach quickly. Sharon nodded. We didn't have time and we needed someone for the next few weeks. Louisa is great, and I had wanted her to help us. We'll likely keep her for next season if she wants to stay. Unless she decides to leave, Jack joked, and they both chuckled. Sharon asked, Does it upset Hattie when she hits a batter? Yeah, a lot. She cried the first time she hit 2 in one game. I had to talk to her about it so she doesn't lose confidence. I've seen that a lot with younger players. Some parents don't know how to handle it either. They want to see the pitcher show they feel bad, Sharon agreed, which makes more batters get hit. Hattie was on the mound, ready to pitch. Sharon continued, That umpire who called that game actually stopped it after several of our girls got hit by pitches. He was brave. He said the other pitcher was in tears and had to be changed. That's not fair play, Jack said. Hattie threw the ball. Strike. She's fast, Sharon said. Yeah, Sharon added, she might be good enough to play on the varsity team next year. We'll see. I'm not sure I want her playing with the older kids, Jack replied as the batter hit a weak ball to first base. Sharon agreed. Being good isn't the only thing that matters. Hattie struck out 9 players in a 6-inning game. She had 1 hit, 2 walks, and stole 3 bases. Her team won easily. August 2015 school days. This is Hattie. It was my first day of high school, my first day at Merciful Savior with a U, like we're British. I had to pay attention as the teacher got to the middle of the alphabet. Mike King, she called. Here, I'm called Mickey, a boy to my right said. Okay, the teacher replied, writing it down. She seemed like she wanted to get to know us. Sarah Leslie. Here, they call me Hattie, I said. Got it. Hattie? She asked. It's my middle name. Haddad, I said. Mrs. Rinker looked up surprised. I think I have the only Arab middle name in sky gray. My birth father was Syrian, so I'm likely a mix of different backgrounds. She looked at me like she wanted to remember my face, but it was the first day of school, and she had many new faces to remember. "Thomas Madden," she called next. "Here," said TJ. It felt like it went on forever. Even though we were freshmen in high school, some of us were still pretty small. Many of the girls had grown taller now that they were 14, even taller than some of the boys. Unfortunately, I was still just a little over 5 feet tall. I was thin, and while my hair was naturally wavy, it could easily turn messy with just a little wind or humidity. My dad wanted me to cut it short, but I liked it long, at least to my shoulders. Grandma liked it that way too. She enjoyed when I put it in ponytails or braids that hung down my back. No matter how long my hair grew, I was still short. The roll call continued, and in each class, the teachers were assigning seats and trying to remember names. This was probably how the first day went in every school. I recognized a lot of kids in my history class from previous years. Grandma convinced Dad to send me to Catholic schools, so here I was at Merciful Savior High. She was not happy when public schools stopped teaching cursive writing, thinking keyboarding was too common. Because of that, they made the choice for me before I even started first grade. I guess it seemed important to them back then. I didn't mind too much, but it would have been nice to go to school with some of my other friends. I knew kids at both schools, but I had always been with the Catholic kids, so they felt familiar to me. I noticed Mrs. Rinker talking about our first assignment, and I had to pay attention. She was giving us a writing task on the very first day of high school. I could tell she was tough. She was really thin and said she runs for fun, which usually isn't a good sign. If this was any hint of what was coming, it might be a long year. She instructed us to interview a parent, guardian, or grandparent to learn about our family history. We were to go back at least one generation. She wanted us to find out what important events our grandparents or parents experienced. What memorable events stood out in their lives? Were they part of any social movements or traditions? Did they join cool groups in the 60s like the Hells Angels or do something else interesting? I dreaded that assignment because my family seemed pretty normal. Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa came from a small town called Sky Gray. It was hard to imagine anything exciting coming from there, even with big events happening around the world. Dad spends all his time reading or writing and doesn't even go on dates. He did get shot in the war, so I thought maybe I could ask him about that. He never talks about it, and I know it has something to do with my adoption, so maybe he would finally share that story. In some of my other classes, we had to share about our summer vacation. In science class, I had to find a fossil by tomorrow. The other kids were freaking out about that, but I just laughed and told them fossils are all over. They just have to look carefully at rocks, especially at road cuts, bridges, or hills. In English class, we were assigned to read To Kill a Mockingbird, and we had to finish some chapters by tomorrow. Dad got home in time for dinner just like he always did, and Grandma had it all ready. When I say home, I mean my grandparents' house. Dad and I lived just down the street by ourselves. Grandpa came in and sat at the head of the table while I sat across from Dad. We often had dinner at Grandma and Grandpa's during the school year since I don't have a mom. "How was your first day of high school, Hat?" Dad asked. "It was okay, I guess. My first class is algebra with Mr. Milken. He seems all right. In the second class, I have American history with Mrs. Rinker. She coaches the softball team. She already gave us homework. I need to interview one of you about important events in your lives. Then I have biology, but I can't remember the teacher's name," I replied. As I talked about my day, I noticed Dad and my grandparents exchanging glances. They had a secret, something they were not telling me. It reminded me of the time I got my new bike, hidden in the garage, or when my cousin Mike got into a bad car accident but ended up okay. They were holding back something important, and I was curious if it had to do with the adoption. Finally, what was the big secret? "What?" I asked. "I can tell you have something to share." Dad looked serious, which made me feel a little scared. "I think after we finish dinner, we should move to the living room. I promise to tell you about your family, the little I know. It also involves how I adopted you. I believe your teacher will like it if you write about it," he said. I felt strange. "So, you're finally going to tell me now?" "I'm not sure how to feel," I said, trying to smile. We moved to the living room, and I sat between Dad and Grandma on the couch, while Grandpa took the big chair that didn't match. Everyone suddenly seemed very serious, as if some heavy news was about to be shared with me, too. Dad began, "I waited to tell you because this is not an easy story to share or to hear. It is part of who you are. It's a story I think you should share with your own children someday. Not everyone has a story like this. While it's not all happy, the good part is that I became your dad." He talked for a long time. After a bit, Grandpa came over to sit next to Grandma. When I started to feel upset, I moved to Grandma's lap and he rubbed my back gently. As Dad spoke, it felt like my life had more meaning and purpose than I had ever realized. It connected Dad, my birth parents, and I learned that I once had 3 brothers. The story included Navy SEALs, I found out what they were, events of bravery, and many people who worked together to protect me. Some even paid the ultimate price for it, while others, like Dad, were hurt or changed forever. I cried quietly. Dad kissed my hair a few times while he talked. I couldn't stop the tears. Some men had been shot, and helicopters were flying to help me. My feet rested in Dad's lap, and he would squeeze them gently. Besides Dad, nobody else said anything. Grandma kissed my forehead, too. When Dad was done speaking, I felt lost. How do you stay calm when you find out your family was killed trying to save you? We sat quietly in the dark living room. A few minutes later, Grandpa got up to grab a soda. Dad picked me up and held me like I was a little kid, with my arms around his neck. Grandma got up to get ready for bed. After a while, when I felt a bit better, I asked Dad how to start my essay for class. He said with such a heavy story, "You might want to ease into it. Start with something funny or light related to it, then slowly explain the deep sadness of what happened." He called it emotional impact. I began writing, restarting many times, but finally I started like this. 2 years ago, we were at a church picnic. A man was joking about Dad's limp. Not too mean, but almost out of line. Dad smiled, and someone told the man that Dad was shot in the back of his leg in the war. I knew that much. Many people did. His leg has a lot of scars, and his limp is easy to see. The man laughed and said, "In the back of the leg? You must have been running away." I remember the man laughing, while some people looked at Dad, feeling uneasy at what he implied. Dad just laughed too and said, "Actually, I was." I think Dad knew he was brave. His words at the picnic held truth, but not the whole truth. He was running away because people were shooting at him, and I was in his arms. Laisha Labhawi's Rinker went by Louise or Louisa, the English name for her Gaelic name. She had argued with her parents about keeping the Gaelic spelling, but after becoming a history teacher, she learned to enjoy discussing the pronunciation. Most people called her Louise, and that was fine. She had never visited Ireland, and to her, Patrick Pearse was just a figure from history, not a hero. She didn't pick sides in that long debate. It was the second day of school, and she arrived early, as usual, with a lot to do. Her arms were full of posters, papers, and 4 textbooks packed tightly in a bin. She hurried up the stairs to her classroom, not stopping to check her mail. She would do that once she dropped everything off. As she turned the corner in the hall, she stopped short. On the floor outside her room, reading a book, was a large man, maybe in his 40s. He looked up, smiled, and with some effort got to his feet. He was even bigger than she expected. He was about 6'3" and had a solid build. Not overweight, just a strong man. "Mrs. Rinker, can I help you with that?" "Yes, thank you." She handed him the bin, then looked for her keys and unlocked her room. "I'm Jack Leslie, Hattie's dad." He stepped inside and placed the bin on a student desk. "I talked to Sharon downstairs. We know each other from years back. She said I could wait up here." "I didn't think a parent meeting would happen so soon," she said, unsure if this visit was good or not. "I understand. I just need a moment of your time and then I'll be on my way. Last night, Hattie shared her project for your class, where she learns about her family's history." He spoke slowly and softly, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, I hear some great stories from students every year. I think it's a wonderful project. I finally told her how our family came to America. I wanted to wait because it's a tough story, sad and hard to hear, but she's 14 and we were all together, her grandparents and me. She got upset. I'm not sure if she has finished her essay yet. It's due tomorrow. Could you please check on her during class? Let me know if she seems upset?" "Of course. I'm very curious to read her story, though I worry it may be emotional. I didn't mean to cause her any distress. Jack shook his head. No, it was my choice to tell her. She needed to hear it. I promised to share it with her when she got to high school. It's a story our family should always remember. I look forward to your reaction when you read it, if she writes everything. He paused. Well, I need to go, he said. She listened closely. It was nice to meet you, Mr. Leslie. Please call me Jack. Thank you again. He turned to leave, and she noticed he had a noticeable limp, likely from sitting on the floor. She thought about how she had never had a father come to her at school, worried about his daughter's feelings. She went to the mailroom and picked up 20 or 30 papers for the second day of school. Next, she stopped by Mrs. Martin's office. Mrs. Martin, what can you tell me about Jack Leslie? Sharon Martin was sitting at her desk, in her 50s, thin and sharp, with a friendly demeanor that still felt firm. You met him? That's good. He's a decent guy, Louise. He's entirely committed to his daughter. What about her mother? Jack adopted her when she was an infant. He's never been married. Wow, a man adopting a girl? I don't know the full story. He said he only wanted to tell Hattie when she was older and kept it private until then. As far as I can tell, no one knows. The grandparents might. It connects back to his time in the war, I believe. He limps, I noticed. He planned to have a career in the Marines, but an injury changed that. By the way, he has a PhD in history. You might have seen his books. Caleb and the Colonel? Mary's thoughts? Jacob Leslie, that's all I know. Never married? Just a hint. Sharon was smiling. Mrs. Rinker paused for a moment. Come on, Sharon. You should know that the tall, handsome man who walked with a bit of a limp and was a kind-hearted ex-Marine is hardly my type. Maybe you're aiming a little high. Hattie is quite beautiful, isn't she? Sharon said. Yes, she is. I'm sure she'll catch the attention of some boys here. She plays softball. Laisha smiled and went back to her room. Coaches always needed more players. Laisha, thinking it was Leslie, felt happy when her classroom phone rang around 4 p.m. Mrs. Rinker? Jack Leslie here. I hope I'm not bothering you. Not at all. Just call me Louise or Laisha, like my family does. Great. I wasn't sure how to say La Bouise. It sounds Gaelic, I guess. Yes, my parents wanted me to stay connected to our roots, she continued. I noticed Hattie looked tired this morning, like she had been crying or didn't get enough sleep. But when I asked about her papers, she didn't say much. I noticed that too. It's good she isn't just crying all the time. Jack, what happened in her story? A big tragedy. I'll let her share it in her essay if she's ready. If not, I'll tell you myself next time. Thanks for your time, La Bouise, he said, mispronouncing her name again as he hung up. Leslie picked Hattie up after school and took her to his parents' house for dinner. His parents really liked Hattie. His mom loved having her around and just put up with Jack. So what do you think of Mrs. Rinker? He asked, trying to focus on something else. He didn't mention that he had visited her. I like her. She seems strong and she's kind of pretty, like you. You should call her, Hattie replied. Hattie, Leslie said, shaking his head. You know I don't date women who are taken. She's not taken, Dad. Some people just call her Mrs. And it stuck. He thought about that and smiled. So, how's the essay? He asked directly. I finished it this morning. I couldn't sleep. It made me cry, she admitted. Can I read it? It's up to you, Leslie asked. She nodded. It's on the computer. I think it's pretty good. I might change a few things before I hand it in. Then she asked, Do you know where they are buried? He hadn't thought about the graves before. Of course, she would want to see them. They were family. In Michigan. I can find out exactly where if you want to go. She looked thoughtful. I'd like that. They were part of our family, too. Maybe one weekend? We could go for the night or just make it a long day trip if you prefer. Do you want Grandma and Grandpa to come? They might like to join us. I'd like that. I want everyone to know how wonderful they were, even if I can't remember them. Jack nodded. You were just 5 weeks old then, Hattie. I don't think you can even turn over yet. I understand you, though. They are definitely part of the family. They must have cared for you a lot. She sent him her essay in an email that he read later that evening. It wasn't long, just 5 pages, typed with normal spacing. But those pages told the story of Leslie's words almost exactly. It described a sad event that led to her being adopted. He liked the beginning, and she had used the saying, "Save one life, save the world," as a theme. The whole essay was much more moving than the usual ones. He wondered what the teacher would think. The next day, Friday, his phone rang after school. "Jack Leslie, please." "This is Jack." "Jack. About the essay. Hattie's essay." "Oh my gosh, Jack. I've never read such a story from a student. I can't imagine anyone with a heart reading it without crying. I can't compare it to others. I mean, some essays are about their grandparents meeting Neil Armstrong at McDonald's or drinking 3.2 beer in the 70s. Jack." There was a short pause. "It's just amazing. Such a story. You were lucky, weren't you?" He nodded. "Very. They took me seriously when I wanted to adopt, even after I was hurt and had few real chances." "I'm amazed, Jack. She's a very good writer," she said. "She knows what makes a story touching." A few moments passed. "Would you like to meet us for some ice cream? At the Aramis shop in 15 minutes? I'm meeting Hattie there." There was just a brief pause. "I'd love to. See you there." Hattie was sipping a pineapple milkshake while sitting in a booth at Aramis, the third Aramis shop, when Mrs. Rinker walked in. Instead of ordering first, Mrs. Rinker noticed Hattie as if she had known she was there and went right up to her table. "Hattie, your father asked me to join you, if that's okay." Hattie looked surprised. "He asked you? My dad never asks women." "Sure, have a seat. So Dad knows you?" They sat for a minute in silence, not really awkward, but not completely comfortable either. "He talked to me yesterday." "I read your essay," Mrs. Rinker said. "It is one of the most touching stories I've ever heard from a student." Hattie looked down for a moment, about to say something, but stopped. Then she looked straight at her teacher, making Laisha notice Hattie's bright blue eyes under her dark hair. "This girl uses emotions and expressions like any 14-year-old I've ever taught," she thought. She wondered if Hattie used her talent to influence her grandparents or dad. "Thank you. It was hard for me to write. I only learned the story on Wednesday when I talked to Dad," Hattie said. "It has sacrifice, love, and history in it. You used a clear method to guide you, didn't you? You hope to find their graves and visit soon. You want to write about the people who helped you. You write from the heart, which is rare in both kids and adults. You could be a writer one day." "I think I'd like to be." "Dad writes for a living now," Hattie said with a smile, looking over Laisha's shoulder. She heard Jack say, "Oh no, they're up to something," he remarked. "I can tell when people are scheming, and this is definitely that. Two women working together." Hattie laughed. "At least it's not something else." Jack said, "Laisha, it's great to see you. Move over a bit. I want to sit by you." "Scoot?" Louise asked, puzzled. "The kid is quick on the baseball field. One of her coaches gave her the nickname Scoot years ago." Hattie had to remind herself to look up again. It was a nice meeting. Jack learned a bit about Laisha's earlier life and decided to pronounce her name the way it is in her culture because it made her smile and added color to her cheeks. She was thin, brown-haired, and attractive. She ran a lot, about 12 miles each week. "My running days are done," Jack said, "but I still ride my bike. My left leg makes up for my right. I'm not fast, but I can keep pedaling even when one leg gets tired. Hills are tough, though." "The essay said you were a SEAL?" Laisha asked. "I wasn't exactly. I was a team leader, but not a true SEAL. I went to a special training school in Israel. They had to find a place for me there. I was second in command for about 7 months, and I was team leader for just a few days because the main leader got hurt, and I was next in line." "If you named her Sarah, why do you call her Hattie?" she asked. Jack looked at Hattie and replied, "Her mother was named Sarah, and I called her that during that long day. After what her family did for her, I didn't want her to forget where she came from. I wanted her to tell everyone who she is and remember how much she was loved. And she still is." He put his arm around his daughter and gave her a gentle hug. Hattie watched her dad and Mrs. Rinker talk about their lives. She wondered why this hadn't happened before. Was something holding Dad back? She hoped it wasn't her. She liked how he acted around her teacher, who he seemed to treat differently. He seemed younger and a bit less sure of himself, paying close attention to small details. She took a sip of her pineapple milkshake, watched her dad laugh, and saw her teacher mix her root beer float. She liked Mrs. Rinker, who, in this ice cream shop, Felt a bit like a grown-up version of a little girl. 2 weeks later, Leslie was surprised to find an email from Captain Luke Ormond, USN, Retdi, in his inbox. Dear Jack, I was surprised and happy to receive a letter from Sarah Haddad Leslie yesterday. I read it quickly and attached it here. She's quite a kid. I told Julie about the time I got hurt during the first mission to help the Haddad family. I only knew that the baby had survived. I showed her the letter, and she actually cried. You call her Hattie, right? Julia said. I remember writing some essays to support your adoption application all those years ago. I hope you've had happy years since then. Have you found that special someone yet? You always seem to miss a step. Being a SEAL leader without attending the SEAL school, starting a family without a partner. I worked at the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. for the Secretary of the Navy and later the Chief of Naval Operations. I retired 2 years ago and now live with Julia and Luke Jr. Rose is studying at Stanford, exploring subjects she enjoys, and Luke is finishing up high school. I have a titanium knee now, and it sets off alarms sometimes. I can't jog or run, but honestly, I never liked it much. I hope your leg is doing the best it can. I had already left the baton when you finished the mission, so I didn't get to thank you or the team in person. I want you to know how I feel. Semper Fi, Marine. You are just as much a SEAL as any of us. Luke Jack smiled and opened the attached PDF. It was handwritten, and he remembered making sure Hattie used cursive. Her writing was neat and clear. Dear Captain Luke Ormond, I am Sarah Haddad Leslie, also known as Hattie. I am the adopted daughter of Captain Jacob Leslie, USMC, Ret, who was your second in command during your missions in the fall of 2001. My father just told me the whole story of how I was rescued from Syria and mentioned that you were seriously wounded while trying to save my family. I want to thank you for your pain and for taking the risk. I wonder if I can ever be deserving of such bravery. I find some comfort in knowing that no one expected me to say thanks, so this letter may surprise you. I feel so lucky that our country has brave men and women who risk their lives for others. I hope you will tell your family about the courageous thing you did for me. Sometimes it's hard for kids to realize how brave their parents are, as if there is another life where parents did amazing things. Let them know that at least one person understands what you did and will always be thankful. Sincerely, Hattie Leslie. She also included her email address and her father's. Over the next few days, Jack received emails from Billy Jackson, Horse, and Domingo Warren, Crate. They thanked Hattie and shared a little about their lives since that time. A few days later, he got a message from Juan Ortiz, who was still in the Navy. He also sent a note to Hattie, saying he caught her when her dad almost threw her to him after being shot. He told Hattie it was one of the happiest moments of his life, and he was glad he went on that mission. Hattie faced her father the morning after his third date with Laisha. Are you having a secret relationship with my history teacher? She asked with a smirk, brushing her hair and checking her outfit before church. Hattie liked to use big words she read in books. She had just finished one and was now reading Anna Karenina, so she probably got the word intrigue from there. I am, if you mean that I am dating her. This is the third time we've met, plus we went for ice cream. You, who can't date because you're too young and not ready, should not act all upset about it. He smiled at her, enjoying the chance to use bigger words. I am not upset. I am happy. You like her? She asked, holding onto his arm as they walked out the door. It was a nice fall morning with leaves changing colors and some already on the ground. I do. Very much. But we are not rushing things, he said. And why not? If anyone should be rushing, it's you and her. I mean, if you put your ages together, do you get like 1 million? If I'm going to have a little brother, you should get to... But Leslie was laughing. He patted her hand and said, There's time for that, Hattie. It's a long way off before we have a child. You'll be the first to know if our friendship grows into something more, okay? But it takes time, and that's part of the fun. Ah, Dad. By the way, she's meeting us at church. Good. She usually goes to that Lutheran church. It's about time she had some real religion. She teaches at a Catholic school. I'll ask her if that makes things different, Jack said. She says we have more ways to be saved. They think it's only by faith. Yeah, I think of it as we have more ways to feel guilty. In a quiet corner of a cemetery in Dearborn, Michigan, They found Sarah Gillespie Haddad, her husband Adnan Haddad, along with their 3 children Joram, Adnan, and Rifat. The markers were simple flat stones, showing the birth dates of the 2 adults and the death dates for all. Jack realized the names must have come from Mr. Agley, who did not know Sarah's. Rifat had helped his sister but was not named, Jack thought. Rifat. Grandpa Leslie was holding a bundle of roses. Hattie had a piece of paper in her hand. She said, "I'd like to say a prayer." She held Jack's hand and read from the paper, "God in heaven, please hear our prayer. We remember these 5 people who saved me. We miss their voices, their hearts, and their lives. I feel their love. Please keep them close because they were brave and selfless, and I am here because of them. Amen." The adults added amen, and it felt serious. Hattie spread the flowers among the 5 graves, 2 of which were quite small. Jack sent an email to Laisha telling her about the trip. His last words were, "I wish I had asked you to come." Laisha knew it was a family trip, and that creating a family took time. She was happy to think that Jack saw her in that way, and it made her smile. Laisha invited Jack to her apartment for a simple dinner and a quiet night on a Friday in early November. Up until now, their dates had been friendly, but not very close. He held her hand while they were out, but never at other times. He kissed her goodnight each time, but there was never any awkwardness about wanting to stay longer. The end of the date really meant the end. They didn't hang out, and Laisha thought that might be because he didn't want her getting too close with Hattie, or maybe he just didn't want Hattie to get too close to her. They talked every day on the phone or online. At first, they talked about Hattie, but soon their conversations turned to family, relationships, and why they were each single. They had been to a movie, a long dinner, a dinner and a movie, a show in Dayton, and now she was inviting him into her home for the first time. She wanted this night to be special. She wore a scoop neck sweater and nice blue jeans, while Jack wore khakis and a long-sleeve polo with a jacket. This was the first time she wore something a bit more stylish, and it was clear it was different from what she would wear to school. She kissed him as she stood in the doorway, and he noticed a lovely scent coming from her. Her hands were on his arms, gently squeezing, and she followed him into the apartment. He could smell dinner cooking. "The food is all ready, but we can wait," she said from behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, leaning against him. Her right hand gently touched his side. "I didn't think this day would ever come for me," she said softly. His hands went to her hips, pulling her closer. He liked the feeling of her. Then he turned and leaned down to kiss her. She wrapped her arms around his neck and their lips met. Years of longing filled the air between them. Jack hadn't been with many women before. He had always been focused on work and school, especially Hattie. He never thought it was right to pursue anything else. For him, being close to someone was about more than just physical attraction. He didn't want to be intimate with just anyone. He wanted it to mean something. He thought of Janice often. Some memories were difficult to forget. In graduate school, he had dated a student, but she didn't take things seriously. To her, being together was just fun, and she thought maybe she would fall in love someday. Dinner had gone cold, but the wine was nice. They both knew they had crossed a new boundary. "Interesting," Sarah said when Leslie came back home around midnight. Jack sighed. "Get some sleep, Sarah. Like I always say, we had a nice evening, we're getting to know each other better, and it takes time." "Ah, Dad," she said, giving him a kiss on the cheek before heading to bed. She wished for him to find someone special, and Mrs. Rinker seemed like a good match. Jack poured himself a drink. It was October, and he had known Laisha for 2 months. He still hadn't met her family. Yet he had to admit the evening had been lovely. He smiled and finished his drink, feeling appreciated. He remembered a warning about women, but he sensed that Laisha was different. "Hi, Mom," Laisha said on the phone. "How are you? How's Dad?" "Oh, we're the same as always. He's around here somewhere, probably hiding with a book. You know how he is?" Laisha laughed. She couldn't remember her father without a book in hand or a cigarette. "I have a new boyfriend, Mom." "Oh, really? Who is he? How did you meet? How long have you known him?" "He's the father of one of my students. He's a writer, a historian, and he used to be a Marine officer." "Is he divorced?" "No, he never got married. He adopted his daughter." Laisha's mother took a moment to think about that. He adopted while he was still single? Her mother asked, surprised. Yes, when she was a baby. She's 14 now. Her mother was quiet for a while. This one seems different, doesn't he? She remembered a string of boyfriends from the past, all promising at first but fading away for various reasons. She had been engaged once, but when he wouldn't set a date, she decided to move on. Then work took over, and for years, that's all she talked about. They thought their lovely daughter simply wasn't interested, but they were mistaken. Some men were indeed interested. She said that a few of her male teachers had shown interest in her, even some who were married, but it all felt quite professional. She wanted to meet men who had more to offer than just their teaching skills. She longed for the kind of man her father was. This thought made her smile. Her dad was small and forgetful, and age had taken its toll on him. Yet in Jack Leslie, she saw a different kind of father figure. Tall, strong, affected by the war, but very much present, much like her dad. She saw in Jack the same kind of dedication her father had for her mother and for her. Her dad had always believed in their goodness and had hope for their future, just like he once had for his church. He would have given anything to help a stranger if needed. She remembered the rumors from his past. Maybe he really would have. Jack had given up his own safety once because he cared about a child he had never met. He had ended up injured, but he had a child to love, just like her father might have. Laisha thought that in many ways Jack and her dad were very similar. Yes, very much. I've never felt like this before. He has a depth and a presence that I've never seen in other men. Maybe some ministers, but he's not really the religious kind. I want to meet him. What's his name? Jack Leslie. Well, Jacob, actually. That sounds familiar. He's a writer, right? Jacob Leslie? Wrote something called Mary's Mind? That's him, Mom. Could you invite him for dinner one weekend? I know it's a bit of a drive. He could bring his daughter along, too, if he wants. I think that's a great idea. I haven't met his family yet, either. Your dad will enjoy meeting a published author, her mother said. If he can make it. How is he doing? It won't be long now, dear. He needs extra oxygen a lot. Laisha became lost in thought, remembering the good times they had, but there had always been too much smoke. Smoke was like a warning sign for them. I need to share something about my dad. Jack felt a bit concerned when Laisha said that. She had not shared much about her family, just that she was an only child, and they were very religious Irish Lutherans living in northern Ohio. He's older now, 76. Before he met my mom, Dad was a Catholic priest. He was quite young and part of a scandal when he was a priest. He was accused of being inappropriate with a woman. They both denied it, but it made the news in Chicago, where he lived back in the 1960s. His bishop didn't believe him, and he decided to leave the priesthood. It was a painful choice for him. He fell into a dark time, started drinking and smoking, and eventually moved to Ohio to start fresh. But when he met my mom, things changed. She helped him find some peace and encouraged him to go to the Lutheran church. He started working again. They got married. My mom is 10 years younger. A year later, I was born. I'm an only child. She paused for a moment, lost in thought. Mom and I have talked about him a lot. We can mention him in the room, and he doesn't realize we're talking about him. Unless we talk directly to him, he doesn't pay attention to what we say. He prefers to read or watch TV, and it's hard to tell if he's focused on one or the other, or if he's doing both at the same time. I think the church scandal hurt him deeply. He felt like no one believed him. He pulled away from life, and Mom helped bring him back a little, but not completely. Jack listened and wondered how secrets and rumors from years ago still affected people today. What about the woman involved? I don't know. A long time ago I asked him, but he just waved his hand and said they didn't talk after the accusations. I think he probably left the priesthood to protect her somehow. It was a sad story, full of mystery. I'm sure there's more to it than we know, but I doubt I'll find out. Dad has breathing problems now from smoking. He still reads a lot as long as breathing isn't too hard. He uses oxygen and usually has a tank near him. It's sad how someone's life can go off track and never really get back on, Jack said. Then you have to find a new path. Maybe not the same destination, but still a good one. Frost's poem talks about how choices can sometimes depend on things we can't control. Laisha nodded. An injury, a rumor, a chance meeting with a teacher? Jack leaned over and kissed her softly. Do you think there's a story with your dad? Jack asked Laisha. Yes, but I'm not sure it's necessary to dig into it. He seems mostly happy. I think he loves Mom and just wants to spend his life with her. If you asked him, that's what he would say. But sometimes there's a look in his eyes that I remember, like he has a wish or a dream that won't come true, or maybe he has a secret he never shared, a regret perhaps. His life has its ups and downs, but it's not bad overall. He seems content in a quiet way. Does your mom ever talk about it? Does she notice it too? I've asked her about it. She believes he was always like this. She doesn't think it's because of the scandal. Maybe it's something from his life before her, just part of living in the world, I guess. Jack thought for a bit before saying, I wonder if anyone can go through life without some worries. That sounds like a good idea for a new book, she said with a smile. Just give me some time. You still haven't read anything I've written. I'm afraid I'll say something that might upset you. It's Hattie writing again. 3 weeks ago, we visited Mrs. Rinker's parents in Sandusky. They seemed small, especially next to my dad. Her father struggled with breathing, hunched over and looking older than his 76 years. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes sparkled as he shook my hand and asked how I was doing. Her mother was healthy. She was younger than her husband and took care of him well. She held my hand gently and looked into my eyes, saying I was beautiful. I felt shy and looked down for a moment. Dad had taught me to accept compliments without getting lost in what he calls my shy fog. I liked Mrs. Rinker's family, but her father seemed weak. She told me he used to be a Catholic priest but left the church and never returned. He loved reading, with books piled everywhere. He gave me an old paperback of The Wall and a newer one called Gone to Soldiers, which sparked my interest in World War II. He chatted with Dad about Caleb, Dad's book about a complex relationship during the Civil War, and he found a copy of Dad's book on a shelf and asked him to write his name in it. Dad wrote a nice message, hoping it would help Mr. Rinker understand his struggles. Mr. Rinker smiled when he read it. I appreciate any help, he said. I guess I'm an open book with my feelings. Dad and he talked and laughed for about an hour while I listened or looked at the books around me. Then Mr. Rinker told me to pick any books I liked. If he had read them, I could take them. I chose the 2 he had given me, but also thought about getting Kate Vaden by Reynolds Price and a couple of others. He mentioned he had All the Light We Cannot See, but he hadn't read it yet. Mrs. Rinker and another woman came in, and we chatted about softball and writing. The other woman said she had sent my essay to a contest, and it was a finalist. Being a finalist meant my essay was one of the top 10 they chose. She shared that the top 3 writers would be invited to a dinner in Washington, D.C., where a government official would give out awards. Last year, it was the vice president. The winner would speak about their essay. When she shared this, Mrs. Rinker looked at me to see how I would react. Well, it's good I won't win then, I joked. They all laughed. I liked the Rinkers, but I felt sad for Mr. Rinker. He struggled with each breath. I read a lot about John Hersey. I wondered why not many people knew his name, as he seemed to be quite popular once. Rachel Apt was a character that stood out. Anyone who could create someone like Rachel should be remembered in literature forever. She was strong, smart, kind, and loving, a character worthy of her own novel, and she was in The Wall. I was really looking forward to reading White Lotus, which is a long story about an American woman in a difficult situation. But I'd have to wait until summer to enjoy it. Instead, I found The Child Buyer, which seemed interesting since I'm adopted, or The War Lover, or A Single Pebble. They were much shorter. John Hersey seemed like a great guy, and maybe he wasn't married. I wished he would wait for me. Then I checked online and saw the sad news. Hersey had passed away. I felt so lost. Maybe I should consider living in a quiet place away from everything. The Wall was really good. If I ever become an author, as my teacher suggested, I'd want to write like John Hersey or someone like Marge Piercy. Gone to Soldiers was so great. What is it that makes stories about World War II so appealing? I need to find more books about it. The War Lover is next on my list. So, Dad met the Rinkers, I discovered 2 good books, and I learned about an author who has died. Then, at Thanksgiving, Mrs. Rinker met my grandparents. It felt less urgent because everyone seemed healthy. Mrs. Rinker wore a warm sweater since it was pretty chilly, and we all gathered around the table eating turkey and pumpkin pie. My grandma is an amazing cook. Mrs. Rinker shared funny stories from her classes and softball games. Dad talked about a new book he was writing. He mentioned having around 10 books started, but only one fully planned. I shared about practicing baseball with Dad, improving my changeup, and a little bit about school. Oh, and I mentioned John Hersey. Grandpa really liked Mrs. Rinker. He held her hand as they said goodbye and whispered something just for her. She smiled and blushed, and it was heartwarming. It was a nice day, and now everyone knew each other's families. But then, the day after Thanksgiving, I discovered my essay was one of the 3 chosen. Dad and I would be going to Washington, D.C. in February. I felt nervous because what if I actually won? At least I'll get a few days off from school. "Hello?" Laisha said, answering her phone. "Hi, Mrs. Rinker? It's Hattie." "Hi, Hattie. Is everything okay?" "Yes, kind of. I just wanted to say I think it's great that my dad is going out with you now. I can't remember him ever doing something like that. I know he had a girlfriend when he was younger, but it didn't work out. I really like your dad. Thanks for telling me. Have you noticed Derek? He's in your class across the room from me?" Laisha had seen Derek looking at Hattie from a distance. "Yes, I've noticed him watching you. Is there a problem?" "I saw him outside my house on Sunday. He was just standing down the street." "Does that make you uncomfortable?" Laisha asked, thinking Derek seemed harmless and might just have a crush. "No, he says hi to me at school, but once he came over in the hallway to say hi and just stood there for a moment. Finally, I said goodbye and walked away." "Do you think he likes you?" Laisha asked. "Maybe, I think so." "I don't know," Laisha replied. "Do you like him?" the teacher asked. "Well, like is a strong word since we haven't really talked. He seems smart," she said. "Oh, he is. If he makes you feel uneasy, I can tell him to give you some space." "No, it's fine. I was just curious if you noticed anything about him. I'll let you know if I see something. Are you reading any books lately?" They continued to chat for a while. Laisha found her situation funny. She liked how open the kid was, realizing it showed a change in their relationship. After they hung up, Laisha thought about calling Jack but decided not to. A week later, this happened again, and then a few weeks went by before it happened once more. Jack invited Laisha to go hiking one weekend in December. Their school had a break because a water main broke, and she agreed to join him. Hattie was going to stay with her grandparents, and Jack planned to be home around 11 after they ate dinner somewhere casual. They drove more than 3 hours to Red River Gorge in eastern Kentucky. They went through the bumpy Nada Tunnel and onto a trail Jack knew well. Laisha was amazed by the beauty of the wooded gorge, even if it wasn't as big as the Grand Canyon. There were many trails. Some were old paths made by Native Americans, and others were for modern hikers. It was easy to reach a cliff top in just a few minutes. Jack was good at hiking most trails quickly. Sometimes climbing to the top was tough for him, needing breaks or to move slowly, but he managed. From the top, they could see a beautiful winter forest. Then, it began to snow. Jack took out a pad to sit on and a small stove from his backpack. As they sat in a cave that had been used by Native Americans long ago, he made tea. They cuddled under a blanket that was really a poncho from his Marine days, sharing a quick kiss as the water heated up. The warm tea felt good, and they didn't need to fill the silence with words. The snow was light, but in the forest, with their view from the cliff, Laisha smiled and said, "Lovely." "I was engaged once back in college," Jack shared. "Her name was Janice. We grew up together. We did everything together." "What happened?" Laisha asked. "We went to different schools. I went to Miami and she went to UC. She always wanted us to wait until marriage. We got close, but we didn't go all the way," he explained. Laisha cuddled closer, sensing he wanted to share more about himself. "During our senior year, we got engaged and showed off the ring. But a few months later, she told me she fell in love with someone else. She was with him the very next day after we got engaged." Laisha shook her head in disbelief. "She didn't tell me for a while, and then she gave the ring back. I saw her wearing a different ring soon after. She said she loved me too, but I was her past and he was her future." He pulled the blanket tighter around them. "Turns out she was going to have a baby. I joined the Marines a little while later, right after graduation." Laisha waited, but he didn't say anything else. They watched the snow fall for an hour until it stopped. They ate lunch, enjoying some cheese and turkey sandwiches that Jack had made, and shared a few kisses. Then they packed up, walked some trails, found a natural arch, climbed Indian stairway, and watched more snow come down. It was a nice day, but he didn't want to take her home yet. After finding their car, they put their bags inside, and Jack kissed her deeply. Laisha looked at him and playfully called him out, "You planned this just to spend a night with me." "Of course I did," Jack said. They drove to Stanton, checked into a motel, bought things like toothbrushes, and found their room. The walk had been chilly, so they wore lots of layers, making a big pile of clothes on the floor. "You look lovely in your clothes," Jack said, pulling Laisha close. "You seem excited to see me," she said, playfully touching his sides as they kissed for a while. Hattie said nothing about their night together. Maybe she hadn't noticed since she came home after Jack. She just kissed him hello when she arrived home that afternoon. They talked about other things. "I went hiking with Laisha yesterday, you know," Jack said. "We're getting closer. I hope you had a great time, Dad." "I think some things are too personal for me to be part of. It's between you and Mrs. Rinker. You are good people, and you mentioned earlier that the journey makes it all worthwhile. I'm glad you had a nice day." Sometimes his 14-year-old daughter seemed wiser than many adults. "That's good. I feel like I'm getting there. She really is wonderful, isn't she? I hope you fall in love. I can see her as my mom, even if I did get a B in the first quarter," she laughed. "It's been 4 months. You haven't dated anyone that long in a long time." "I know. This is all new for me, too." They spent Christmas at his parents' house, and Laisha went home to be with her family. The day after Christmas, she called to say her dad was very ill and in hospice care. 2 days later, her father's heart stopped after struggling to breathe. His long fight was finally over. Laisha called again a little later to tell them she would stay for his funeral at the end of the year. Jack and Hattie drove to Sandusky for the funeral, which was private since he had mostly kept to himself during his long illness. A few friends invited by his wife came, but there were only a handful of them. Hattie and Laisha stood quietly by the open coffin for a while, talking softly. Jack saw that at one point they had their arms around each other. Later, Jack asked Laisha quietly, "What did Hattie say to you before?" Laisha replied, "She told me that even if you don't remember him, losing a parent is never easy." Jack nodded, understanding. A few moments later, Laisha spoke as if she had been thinking deeply. "Hattie is no longer just my student. We will finish the school year, but it means so much more now. She calls me sometimes to talk or ask for advice about a boy or other things." Jack smiled and took her hand. "That's great. I'm serious about us, too." "She asked if I could think of her as a daughter," Laisha said. "She thinks of me more like a mom." "Being close to my child is not a good enough reason to marry me," Jack replied honestly. "I'm saying that if you aren't serious, if we aren't heading toward marriage, then it might be better for her if we—" she started. Jack looked at her seriously, and the pause was long enough that Laisha wondered if she had misunderstood. "I thought my feelings were clear, Laisha. I crossed that line a while ago. I just needed to know my love was returned. I love you, Laisha." Laisha kissed him on the cheek, and he had to bend down a little while she stood on her toes. Mrs. Rinker decided she would stay in her own house as long as she could. Laisha offered to help her move in with her, but Mrs. Rinker didn't want to leave the community she knew. Unlike her husband, she was part of a card club that met weekly. She was on the church scheduling committee, and she had other activities, too. Laisha thought about getting a job near Sandusky to be closer to her mom, but her mother quickly dismissed the idea. Mrs. Rinker said, "You just found a wonderful guy, and his daughter is great, too. Why would you want to make them choose between you and their life? I could never forgive myself for that. If I'm not ready to give up my card games to live with you, why are you thinking of leaving your new family to take care of someone like me?" Jack and Hattie drove home after the funeral. They talked a lot about Laisha and the part she played in Hattie's life. Jack realized that having a child can change even the best plans. It can make things rush forward or slow them down. Laisha joined them on New Year's Day. The Institute for Government and the Family was a neutral group that studied how government programs affected families. They did not support any politicians or suggest any laws. Their main job was to study families and how the government influenced them. They funded research and kept track of families' lives and structures over time. Their leadership changed every 2 years, usually alternating between a Democrat and a Republican. Each year, they held an essay contest for students aged 13 to 15. The top 3 essay writers brought their families to Washington, D.C., and the winning essay was shared. They announced the winner at an award dinner in mid-February. Hattie asked Mrs. Rinker if she would come with them. Mrs. Rinker agreed, saying, "I'll take some personal days off." Hattie practiced reading her essay to Jack and Mrs. Rinker, just in case she won. Deep down, she hoped she wouldn't win. She didn't want to speak to a big crowd like the one that attended last year. The dinner was a fundraiser for the organization, and this year's essay topic was, "How has government affected your family?" Jack wondered if the organizers expected a different kind of essay than the one Hattie wrote. Maybe it was just unique enough that she was chosen as a finalist. Leslie wore a suit, and his parents came along paying their own way. Laisha looked elegant in a dress that was stylish but not too revealing. She wore a shawl that matched and let her brown hair fall around her shoulders. Leslie was impressed by how classy she looked, as if she was used to attending fancy events. Hattie wore a dark blue, long-sleeved dress that made her eyes stand out and highlighted her dark hair. Her grandmother called her beautiful and gave her a small pearl necklace to match the blue. They were seated at a round table at the front of the room, to the left of the stage where a lectern with a microphone stood. Everyone sat at round tables with space for about 6 people at each one. The other 2 finalists were on their right, standing out because they were younger. Not many people paid $600 for a meal for a 15-year-old. The finalists and their families were allowed to join for free. Hattie wasn't smiling. Jack held her hand as they walked in, much taller than her. As he looked around the room, he thought that Hattie was the prettiest person there, and he realized he was thinking of her as a woman instead of a girl. This brought on new worries in his mind. They were soon joined at the table by a woman in a uniform from another country's military. She was someone Leslie recognized but couldn't remember at first. Jack stood up when she arrived. "General, I'm surprised to see you here." "Captain," she replied, her accent strong. "It has been a long time." Jack shook her hand and then turned to introduce his daughter, Laisha, and his parents. "This is General Naftali Meyer from the Israeli Defense Forces. I knew her when I was training in the Israeli SEAL School," he said, then added, "And this is my daughter, Hattie." Everyone shook hands, and eventually they all sat down. "Miss Leslie," General Naftali Meyer said, "you go by Hattie?" "Yes, ma'am," Hattie replied. They talked for a while, the noise around them making it hard for others to hear. Sometimes Hattie smiled and even laughed, holding her papers just in case she won. Laisha, sitting next to the general, seemed to enjoy chatting with her too. Jack had never spoken casually with the general before, and he was grateful she had come to their table and was being kind to Hattie. Later, Hattie mentioned that the general talked about the need for the Semites to support one another during the event. There were speeches about fundraising, and different officials spoke about the important work of the Institute. As dinner was served, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the lectern. "Tonight, we honor our essayists. Copies of the 3 finalists' essays will be passed out, 1 to each table." She continued, introducing Misha Bratansky from California and asking the young girl to come up. Miss Bratansky wrote about her family's struggles with moving to a new place and the support they received from various government programs. It is a wonderful story, and we are proud to give her this plaque. She handed Misha a plaque while cameras clicked. Misha's family stood and received a warm round of applause. Next, the master recognized Jorge Villanos, who got help from a state program in New Mexico when his dad lost his job. She called Jorge up to present him with a small plaque as well. Once again, the family stood and was applauded. By this time, the dishes had been cleared, and there would be a few minutes before dessert. The master of ceremonies looked over at Hattie from the podium. "Miss Leslie, could you and your family please come up?" Hattie glanced at Jack, who was smiling. General Meyer said, "You won, dear." Hattie looked down at the papers she was holding, then forced herself to look at her dad, who smiled, nodded, and stood up. Her grandparents stood up too, smiling and moving around the table. Laisha, as they had agreed, went up as well. Leslie noticed that Hattie's left hand was in Laisha's right hand. They walked to the steps leading up to the podium. Leslie stood behind Laisha, his parents stood beside him, and the little girl, who was a bit taller than the lectern, stood just in front of her grandparents. A big box was nearby for her to stand on when it was her turn. The master of ceremonies was not done speaking. Usually, we don't hear much from the military about family during the essays we receive. We rarely touch on military missions or the brave who are hurt. But Sarah's essay struck us hard. Oh, wait, she goes by Hattie, not Sarah. Typically, our presenter comes from a welfare group or health services. This is the first time someone from the military will give an award for its good work with families. Hattie, if you would read your essay, please. The master of ceremonies stepped back. The box was placed behind the lectern, and Hattie let go of Laisha's hand and climbed to look out at the crowd. She smiled, looked down, and began to read. We were at a church picnic, and she continued reading. Reaching the end of the introduction, she said, was running away, and I was in his arms. She took a deep breath and looked back at Jack, silently saying, I love you. He nodded and smiled back. Laisha noticed and squeezed his hand. Hattie's voice and words brought Leslie back to an important time, the last day he walked without pain, the first time he met his little girl, the end of his military career, and the start of his family. Captain Leslie, you are needed in the Combat Information Center. Captain Leslie, please report to CIC. In his room, Leslie felt very tired. He had written his report, checked on the injured, and finally taken a shower. Commander Ormond had already been moved from the baton for treatment, but Leslie had delayed sleeping to finish his tasks, and now he had one more. He hoped his team was already asleep. He dressed and made his way to the Combat Information Center. Just then, he was called into the conference room by Captain Miller, the commander of the baton, who was a black captain. All ship leaders are called captain, but the baton's was also a ranking captain. The old man they had rescued a few hours earlier was sitting at the table drinking coffee. There was a map laid out with satellite photos next to it, and there was an X marked on a little building in the middle of nowhere. The old man stood when Leslie entered. I want to thank you, Captain, the old man said with a noticeable accent. He spoke perfect English, which the commander had noticed during their first meeting. Thank you, sir, Leslie said, shaking the man's hand. Captain Miller addressed everyone. Please take a seat. Mr. Aglai has informed us that an American woman and her children are in danger. She is married to a Syrian engineer. A local extremist group has threatened and harmed many Christians and Americans in their area. Leslie raised an eyebrow. Was this why they were here? He had thought the old man was a spy or maybe someone important. Now Leslie understood the situation better. Captain Miller signaled to his assistant, who poured Leslie a cup of coffee. Leslie declined cream or sugar and took it black. We have a mission to rescue them tomorrow night. Today was too risky, being just a few miles away. We're gathering information and pictures. A drone is already on the way to the location and should arrive soon. Another will go in during the daytime. Sir, Leslie said, my team needs rest tonight. I only have 6 enlisted men and myself. Captain Miller was quiet, tapping his fingers on the side of his cup. His fingers were long and well kept. The cup was full, but he barely took a sip. Leslie could tell he was tired. Only when he was worn out did he notice small details like that. Captain Miller said sincerely, I want you to get some rest, Mr. Leslie, but I wanted you to know the mission was approved as soon as we could. I'll see you here tomorrow at 10 a.m., sir. I expect you around 4 p.m. tomorrow. We'll have more information for you then. Make sure your team is ready any time after that. You need to rest tonight. Check on your men and your gear. Tomorrow night could be very long, and we need you at your best. We will probably land a helicopter in a field close to the target house and then pick everyone up safely. 4 kids and 2 adults if we're not too late. Leslie stood. I'm going to inform Ortiz and get some sleep. 10 minutes later, he was asleep in his bunk. Ortiz was frustrated about another mission coming so soon, but he was always upset when missions didn't have 10 days preparation time. The next afternoon, the drone spotted a car approaching the house, but then it had some technical issues and crashed while the pilot tried to bring it back. We don't think anyone is alive, Jack, Captain Miller said. As soon as it gets dark, we'll send you in. If there is anyone else at the site, the mission is off. The pilot located the house using GPS. This place was far from the nearest village. It wasn't their home, but where the Haddads had hoped to escape the extremists. There were 2 small rooms and an outdoor toilet at the end of a short path. Nearby was a well. A quick check for people was made, but there was no sign of a guard or anyone else. Mr. Aglai mentioned that they had hoped to stay hidden there, but some folks had passed by a few days earlier. A man was seen watching them from a distance. They felt like they were being watched, even at night. Aglai became their link to the outside world. He visited once a week, bringing them supplies. Just a month back, an infant was born in that house, helped into the world by her father, about a month after they arrived. 2 days ago, when Adnan told him they were being watched, Aglai used his satellite phone to contact the American embassy in Amman. He was searching for a way to help the Haddads cross the border. The embassy looked him up and found out that Aglai had taught at several universities in the U.S., and that one of his former students was married to Sarah Gillespie from Dearborn, Michigan. Sarah Haddad graduated from Eastern Michigan University with a degree in American history. Her husband had a master's degree in hydraulic engineering from the nearby University of Michigan. He was involved in building water systems in the desert back in their home country. Sarah raised their children, who were Christians, until local extremists stopped them from practicing their faith. Now, Mr. Aglai was worried for their safety and believed it might be too late for them. Leslie asked Aglai why he cared so much about this family. He replied, "I convinced Adnan Haddad to come back here to work and bring his family. I told him he should love his homeland and help improve it. He worked here for a few years, and then this." He was angry about how moderate Islam was being attacked. The violence from extremists often silenced the moderate views held by the majority. The team flew on a helicopter to a small field where the Haddads hoped to grow vegetables, across a dirt road from the little house. It was dark as they descended, after surveying several other fields. Once the team got down, the helicopter moved away, hovering another 2 miles away. 4 team members, including Ortiz, kept watch around the house, mainly looking for the suspected watcher, while Leslie and Ranger entered the home. They knocked on the door but got no answer. Leslie pushed the door open easily. It was unlocked. Sarah? Sarah Haddad? U.S. Navy? He peeked in but saw nothing at first. After looking around, he found the small living space of the house. The other room was at the back, through a doorway that had no door. Suddenly, he saw feet that were not moving sticking out from the doorway, and his heart sank. His fears turned true. He quickly reported through the communication device, "I found Sarah. She is dead. A bullet wound to her head. Her husband is next to her. Also dead. 1 shot to the head." "Stay near your areas and look for the kids," Leslie said calmly. He didn't hear anyone respond, but he guessed what they were thinking. The 3 boys were found in different spots, all shot. One boy, around 7 or 8 years old, was shot in the back, far from the house, on a small hill above the restroom. The 4-year-old and 3-year-old were found inside the restroom, each shot in the forehead. "Did anyone see the baby?" Leslie asked. "No, 6, came the answer repeatedly. "Maybe they took her," Ortiz said. "That's possible, too," Leslie replied. "But I am not leaving an American child out here if we can find her. I'm going through that house. I'll hold the helicopters for a few minutes." "Got it," came the reply from several team members. "Stay alert for any bad guys, or for the baby. Listen for her." Leslie lifted the floorboards, flipped the mattress, and searched the closet, walls, and ceiling. He found some wooden toys, a flat soccer ball, books, clothes, and utensils. But there was no child alive in that house. He ran outside, climbed onto the roof, and checked the restroom. He saw the 2 little boys placed outside by varmint. He looked down into the pit. No baby there. He hurried over the hill to where the oldest boy had died. His night vision goggles saw nothing. The sound of the helicopter was getting closer. "Leave the bodies 6?" Ortiz asked. "No, we can't do that. 4 of them are Americans. He should be with his family. Load them up. I need to think." He followed the others who were carrying the bodies to the north field. Leslie thought about the couple. They must have realized someone was coming for them, to hurt them because they were Christian or American or just infidels. Sarah would have known there was little hope. thinking her children were in danger. She might have sent the two youngest to hide, perhaps straight to the restroom, which could have been a mistake, hoping no one would look. Or she could have told them out the back window, "Run, hide, don't let them catch you, go." The two youngest hid in the restroom, but what about the older boy, 8 years old? He worried as the helicopter landed. SEAL Squad Unnumbered, also known as SEAL Squad Detached, loaded 5 bodies onto the Chinook. Ortiz counted them once everyone was on board and shook his head, thinking about the missing baby girl. As Leslie stepped to enter the helicopter, a thought hit him about the 8-year-old who had died on the hill. But chaos erupted, and SEAL Squad Unnumbered, secured in the Chinook, took off without their Marine. An RPG missed the back rotor of the Chinook by about a foot, but that foot turned into a long distance before it exploded. Gunfire erupted from across the field north of the house. Leslie shouted, "Go, go, go!" Realizing he was giving up his seat on the helicopter, he was just a step away from getting inside. He quickly spoke into the radio. "Ortiz, I have the sat phone." "I think I know where the girl is. I'm going to call her," Ortiz said. Ortiz was feeling frantic. "We can't leave you behind!" he shouted, urging the pilot to return to the ground. But the helicopter's guns started firing, and there was chaos all around. The pilot's main job was to get the chopper to safety, so that's what he did. In moments, they were away from danger, but the pilot felt terrible for leaving the SEAL Squad leader back on the ground. Cobra helicopters were on their way from Jordan and would arrive soon, but there was no way to know what dangers Leslie was facing. Ortiz remembered Leslie's last words. He was going to find that child. "Keep all fire to the north of the house. The bad guys are there. We have a friend on the ground, and we lost another to the south, I hope," Ortiz instructed, thinking about the sadness of being left alone and the fear of a lost child. Unlike Commander Ormond, Ortiz had no real family left. His mother was out there somewhere, but they hadn't spoken in years. Still, he understood how deeply the thought of a lost child could affect good people. He recognized the captain's strong feeling to act. The Cobra was flying low over the ground north of the house, and the shooting stopped. It was 1 a.m. locally, and Ortiz braced himself for an angry captain soon. "Good luck, Jack. Find her," he thought. "What do you mean, Chief? You left him behind. I'm hearing the radio and he didn't get on board?" Ortiz stood straight in front of the captain, away from the helicopter and the 5 bodies on the deck. He recognized a rhetorical question when he heard one. He had a college degree in English from different naval stations, but he also had common sense from his years in the Navy. He stayed silent. "Why?" the captain asked. That was not a rhetorical question. Ortiz knew that Navy captains wanted to become admirals and were very close to their goal. This captain had made it clear over time that he respected the Marine captain, probably the only one he did. "Sir, right before we left, Captain Leslie said he thought he knew where they might have hidden the child. Then an RPG shot past us and we had to take off. He has the satellite phone, so he should be able to reach us when he's safe." Ortiz realized that he sounded weak. "If he ever makes it back safe," Ortiz thought. "If he ever makes it back safe," the captain echoed. "Sir, the mission must go on. I'd like to prepare the team for another extraction tomorrow night. It seems too risky to go today," Ortiz suggested. Captain Miller replied, "So ordered. I'll let them know we left him behind and want to go back." He meant he would tell his boss, who would tell her boss, and she would tell another person, all the way up to someone in the White House. Leslie thought the enemy fighters did not realize that one American was still there. He hurried to some bushes and crawled up the hill behind the house as a Cobra helicopter passed overhead. After 10 minutes, everything went still. The helicopters were gone. The fighters were either dead, far away, or hiding, wondering if it was safe. He knew a drone was up there, probably tracking him, but that wouldn't last much longer. He moved past the outhouse, following the shape of the hill, and hid in a dip that led him higher. He climbed to the top of the hill and went down to the spot where the 8-year-old boy had died, shot in the back while trying to run away from the house. In the dark, he searched carefully, trying not to touch anything. He used his night vision goggles but found nothing. The heat sensor should have picked up a living child, unless she was hidden under rocks. He reached into the gaps, moved bushes aside, but found nothing. He paused to think. The boy likely played hide-and-seek on this hill and might have known a good spot to keep his sister safe. Jack searched every corner for an hour, feeling more anxious until he heard a sound. At first, he worried that they had been found. She would give away their hiding spot to any fighters nearby. But he stood tall, risking being seen, and followed the faint cry to a small space between two rocks, a place where a small child could remain hidden. Leslie spotted the shadow and, with care, reached out to feel a small child. He didn't have much experience with children. He quickly got onto his knees, holding his rifle behind him, and lifted the child carefully. She was tiny, only 5 weeks old, and she whined softly. There was a small piece of cloth in her mouth. Was it to soothe her, or to keep her quiet? He took it away. She was wrapped in a light towel and a small blanket, not tightly, but enough to keep her from moving around too much. The night was mild, about 50 degrees, and Jack thought she was safe from the cold, although she might be uncomfortable. He knew she needed food or water to stay quiet, but he guessed she couldn't eat solid food at her age. She probably drank from her mother's breast. He had to find nourishment for her to keep her alive until help could come. He needed to get milk or something else for a baby, or they risked her crying and giving away their location. The only place he could find supplies was in the house. Maybe there was canned milk or formula that could help. What could he find there? What were his options? He was a Marine in southern Syria, surrounded by committed fighters. What would a Marine give to a baby? He had a meal ready to eat, MRE, some extra instant coffee, creamer, and sugar. He always packed extra coffee and creamer. He looked around. The hiding place was well chosen. He gently put her back where she was, making sure her blankets covered her face. Then he crawled back over the hill toward the house, which was quiet and dark. His knees hurt from crawling over the stones, but he pressed on. He kept his light off to protect his night vision. He didn't have any batteries left. He moved carefully, thankful for the training he received in stealth. When he saw movement near the house and a flashlight, he backed away slowly. He heard voices. Resupply from the house was not going to happen. He stayed low and quietly made his way back over the hill. He couldn't find her. For a moment, panic washed over him as he searched. No rock felt right, then one did, but it turned out to be wrong. And then another. He forced himself to stay calm. What if I lost her, he thought. He heard a sound and moved to the left. Staying quiet, he focused on listening closely and finally heard it. It had to be her. He found a small space between two rocks. He heard soft sounds, and he reached out and felt a warm baby wrapped up. Again, on his elbows, he lifted her carefully in his rough hands. He held her close to his protective vest. Of course, they couldn't feel each other through all that, but he pretended they could. He moved them further from the house, finding a spot between the rocks that would hide them from the sun when it rose, hoping the bad people wouldn't come by. Sitting among the rocks on a cloudy night, he opened his vest and jacket, holding her against his t-shirt so she could feel his warmth and maybe his heartbeat. He could feel hers. He listened for any sounds around him and held the sleeping baby. She was warm in his arms. SEALs were often private people, but Mr. Aglai felt a heavy sadness when he learned about the deaths of the Haddad family. Soon, everyone on the flight deck knew about the mission and its failure. He held on to hope for the baby, whom he had only seen once 2 weeks ago. He didn't know her name. Heartbroken yet hopeful, he talked to others on the flight deck, waiting for the return of the Haddad family. Seeing the bodies, the sailors and the chaplain noticed his pain. He felt guilty for urging the family into danger. News spread quickly that the SEAL squad leader stayed behind to search for the baby. For once, the usual tough attitudes of military folks softened as everyone hoped that baby Haddad was safe and that the Marine would find her. It was 3 hours before Leslie called Captain Miller. "Captain, SEAL Squad Detached 6. I found the package. She was safe and sound. We are escaping." Miller could tell good news when he heard it. He looked at the others nearby. He found her safe and sound. Suddenly, people started cheering and clapping. Smiles spread across the flight deck in the middle of the night, somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. The mission became the only thing that mattered. Sailors who were just going through the motions became more focused on their tasks. They were careful while loading the heavy rounds, checking the important parts, and adjusting the big guns. Everyone thought there would be a rescue attempt the next night. Miller let himself smile. Jack and a baby were lost in the desert. Now he had to find a way to save them. The rescue was finally set for the next night, 1 kilometer from the house, in complete darkness. The baby had 2 messy diapers, which he mostly ignored. He took an old cloth to clean the rocks and moved away. She was starting to get a rash, so he wet a piece of his t-shirt with water and wiped her. He let her bottom dry without anything on. He thought, "Sarah, just hold on for a few more hours." Every sound made him worry it was an enemy. Every few hours he moved further up the hill, looking for shade, trying to stay away from the house, slowly making his way to the rescue. But they were still far from the top of the hill. He didn't drink much, saving one of his 2 canteens, which held 1 liter of water for her to drink and to clean her. He decided to give her most of the canteen. She drank very little and he needed a lot, but he made sure to keep some for her. He poured water on another piece of his t-shirt, since the one she had sucked on was too small. He let her suck on that for a while. Then he made a paste from coffee creamer and dipped the shirt into it, wrapping it around his finger for her to suck on. He felt her gums and noticed she didn't have any teeth yet. When do babies get teeth? He wondered. He scanned the nearby area as much as he could, but he had to protect, clean, and take care of the baby. How much could he learn to take care of a baby in the field? He smiled at the thought. His mission was to care for this child. They lay in the shade of some rocks where it was hot. The sun was strong, and even the shade was a little better. But October wasn't too hot, and it was manageable. He checked his map. The land sloped down after reaching the hill to the south, leading straight to the landing zone. The best part about operations in Syria was the many places to land. He spent the day waiting it out, trying to keep the baby happy. He played with her, tickled her, gave her water and creamer paste. He rubbed his nose against her tummy near her tiny belly button. He made funny sounds he had never made before, mostly quietly. He looked for her smile, which she gave him sometimes. He feared her crying, since it could bring trouble. He thought about his 2 options. No. He wouldn't do anything to harm her. He would fight for her, but he wouldn't risk giving her too much medicine by mistake. By late afternoon, he stayed very close to the child, never going further than 10 feet away. He thought about his feelings. It was important for her to be American for the mission to go ahead, but that wasn't why he was there. If she were from another place, like Palestine or Tutsi, he would have sent the helicopter away. What mattered was that she was in danger, she was innocent, and he was the only one who could help her. It was a heavy duty, but also a great chance. Leslie wanted the story to end well, even though it started so sadly. He called her Sarah after her mother. "They died for you, little one," he whispered. "Your mom and dad, your big brothers, they all died for you. I will get you out of here if I can. They deserve for you to survive." 4 hours before it was time to leave, Leslie told Captain Miller he was moving to watch the area where they would pick them up as the sun set. The captain replied, "A SEAL squad will provide security during the pickup." Leslie smiled. Ortiz would be there, which made him feel better. He wondered what the team thought of him, since he had just been their leader but was now leaving them. He looked up for a drone but saw nothing. Perhaps it was too high, too small, or not there at all. He held her in his left hand, her little body tucked against him, her legs curled. With his right hand, he could reach for his pistol, his rifle, his knife, and his satellite phone. He had been careful using the phone and its battery, not knowing how long it would last. He walked more slowly than usual, sometimes holding the child in both hands. It wasn't a long walk to the top of the hill where he could see the pickup spot. After half an hour and only about 250 meters, he reached the top. With several more hours before the pickup, he watched the area and the path they had taken. It was almost dark. He heard something behind them. They were not alone. He found a hiding spot and waited. On the phone, he heard, "Drone overhead. You have at least 3 enemies nearby. Nearest is 120 meters west, none south, 200 meters east." The report went on. "All are staying put." He thought they weren't tracking him. Instead, they must have a wide area they were watching and might have spotted him on the way to the hilltop. Maybe they were just being careful in case the Americans returned. He felt they were in a good spot. He heard movement below, but no voices. Maybe it was just one guard. The child slept in the warm evening air, and Leslie watched the sky as it slowly became darker. The twilight lasted a while, but finally faded away. She woke up. He gave her some more plain water. She sucked on the wrap around his finger, which he kept wet with water. "No noise, baby," he thought. "If you can, Sarah, don't cry." But he was ready. If she cried, he would grab her and run straight to the pickup spot. He thought, no matter what happens, I have to keep going, and he smiled. With 20 minutes left to get out, he heard noise but couldn't see anyone near the hill where he was. He told his team that he and the little girl were 400 meters away and moving to the landing zone in a zigzag pattern. The movement shook the girl, and she began to cry. Feeling urgency, Jack decided to push ahead. Using his night vision, he jogged when he could see more open land. The little girl's cries stopped as they moved. He knelt down and checked his GPS as he reached the field he believed was the landing zone. Lying flat on the ground with the child safe beneath him, he whispered, "You are Sarah Haddad, and your parents loved you. Please let us be safe. You will live a long life with my help." He heard helicopters in the distance. Suddenly, bullets flew by, but they were aimed elsewhere, and Leslie quickly adjusted his M4 to get ready. Sarah lay on the ground beneath him. Everything happened quickly after that. Leslie was sure he had hit at least one or two of the attackers in the 10 seconds he was firing. Their movements made it easy to spot them. He shot at some flashes from the hilltop he had just left, and they went quiet. Silence filled the air, and after a moment, a helicopter began to approach, with another one circling above. He grabbed Sarah gently in his left hand, hoping not to bother her tiny, dried umbilical cord. He ran toward the helicopter that was about to land 75 meters away when an RPG went past him and the child, hitting the ground beyond the chopper. He was shouting now, worried about getting hurt by friendly fire. He was running 50 yards to go. He wondered how long it would take. 20 yards. He saw scattered people around the helicopter firing past him. He was so close to the Chinook when he felt a sharp pain in his right thigh, and suddenly running or crawling didn't matter anymore. His right leg wouldn't work. He had the child under him, and he fell to shield her, using his left elbow to brace himself against the rocky ground and keeping her away from the rocks with his left hand, falling onto his right to protect her. Pushing up with his left leg and right hand, he got himself mostly upright when he felt another shot hit his right calf. He thought, "Come on, leave me alone, that leg is already hurt." He was half kneeling, his right leg useless, but he pushed himself up with great effort. He hopped toward his goal. He heard someone yelling, "Mr. Leslie!" He finally reached Ortiz by the ramp. Ortiz and his team were backing up, firing into the bushes. The helicopter above was shooting more powerful weapons. Ortiz reached out for Leslie, and Leslie swung his left hand, feeling Ortiz grab the child. He saw the joy in Ortiz's eyes as he held a gift from above. Everything around Leslie faded away, and he didn't care anymore as he fell forward. In that brief moment of relief, Leslie thought, "I did what I had to do. I hope the child is okay. Please let her be safe." He saw his team jump into the helicopter as it took off, bullets firing. He heard another helicopter overhead. "Ortiz!" Leslie shouted over the noise of the flight. "Take care of the kid!" Ortiz, holding the child awkwardly like a new parent, gave a thumbs up. Leslie glanced at his team as Varmint wrapped a bandage around his leg. They were all smiling, and he felt good surrounded by them. They congratulated him and patted his shoulder. There was a feeling of togetherness, a feeling that this time they all knew why they were there. Someone gave him a painkiller, and warmth spread through him as they flew over the ocean. When the helicopter landed on the Baton, sailors clapped for them. Ortiz handed Sarah to a nurse on the flight deck, and then Jack was lifted onto a stretcher. "Sarah," Leslie said. "She's gone," he heard someone say. No, that couldn't be true. For 5 weeks she was alive, crying and cooing. He felt like screaming, but "Sarah Haddad, she died before the raid," came the response. "No, the child," he insisted, hoping someone would understand, wishing they had made a mistake. But there was silence. "Mr. Leslie, are you there? Mr. Leslie?" He wished he didn't hear that voice. "Wake up, Mr. Leslie! Jacob, wake up!" someone said. It felt surreal, like a voice calling him back from somewhere else. "Jacob, wake up! Yes?" Jack responded. Did they hear him? He opened his eyes but couldn't focus. He tried to calm himself but kept thinking about that child. Was she safe? He felt a hand on his shoulder, and he noticed the pain in his leg. Suddenly, his memories returned. He remembered throwing her to Ortiz and the helicopter, the hits to his leg, which throbbed now. He finally saw a woman in a uniform smiling at him. "Where?" he managed to say. "You're on the baton, Captain," she replied, misunderstanding him. No, where is Sarah?" "The girl?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper by the end. "Oh," she smiled, happy to reassure him. "The child is here, safe. She's doing great. Your team is here too. Ortiz had to go to a meeting, but he was here all night. I'm your nurse. It's been nearly a day since you arrived." Leslie relaxed back into his pillow, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Sarah was okay. He had gotten her out safely. But darkness surrounded him, and he wasn't sure what was real anymore. Leslie heard someone say, "An email from an Israeli Colonel Meyer." He struggled to sit up and pull himself together. He groaned before saying, "Meyer?" He noticed a woman close by, her ear near his mouth. "Colonel Meyer," he said, hoping he was loud enough. "Yes," the voice replied clearly. The woman was trying hard for him to understand. "Colonel Meyer writes, 'You are S-13, Mr. Leslie.' What does that mean?" Leslie felt proud. "It means she's proud of me," he breathed out, feeling tears on his cheeks. He wondered how she knew. He then heard someone say, "I think every woman on this ship, including some pilots, has spent time with that girl since she arrived. She gets plenty of love." Leslie smiled at that thought. "I couldn't hug her much with my vest on," he replied. "She's wonderful," the voice said. Leslie looked up to see a woman named Smith standing above him. "So we're awake," a man's voice came from the other side. "I'm Bill Johnson, Captain." He was taller than Ensign Smith and in charge. "I operated on your leg. We took a bullet out of your thigh. It broke your bone, and it took us a long time to fix it. That's the bad news. The good news is it should work, but you might have trouble jogging or walking without a limp. The other bullet went straight through. It caused some soft tissue damage, but it should heal nicely." Hearing that his career might be over was hard for Leslie. He realized his days as an active Marine were likely done. "Will I have to leave the Marines, Doc?" he asked, feeling the doctor's hand on his shoulder. "I can't think of a better reason for you to leave," the doctor replied gently. Leslie felt a tear slide down his face, and the doctor looked away. "Can I see her, Sarah, the baby? I had to call her something that day, and I didn't know her name." Ensign Smith was surprised to see Leslie cry. She could tell he wasn't ashamed. "I think I can arrange that for you," she said, looking at the doctor. "With your permission, sir?" "Of course," he answered. 15 minutes later, propped up in his bed, he held Sarah again. It felt natural and right. Shortly after, he had a wild idea. "Ensign," he called as she came to take the baby back, "could you send me the chaplain?" "Of course." The chaplain, a Navy commander, came to see him a few hours later. The medical staff didn't usually listen in on chaplain visits aboard the Baton. Conversations like these were very private and important. Many people who were close to leaving this world had shared their final thoughts in a public place, just behind a curtain. No one ever talked about what they heard, out of respect for those moments. But Ensign Smith was nearby when she caught part of a conversation. She listened for a moment longer, knowing it wasn't a religious discussion. Then, unexpectedly, the chaplain, who usually looked serious, was laughing. Everyone turned to the curtained bed where Ensign Smith was smiling and shaking her head. For 15 minutes there was silence. Finally, the chaplain pulled the curtain back and said, still smiling, "Jack, this is my first time doing this. I've helped back home, but not during deployment. You've made my day, maybe even my whole time here. Get that letter written, and I'll let the captain know what's happening." "Mom, put me on speaker." "But Jack, it's the middle of the—" Then she realized something must be wrong. Jack usually called at night from far away just to say he was safe after missions. This call felt different. Leslie imagined her turning on the light, looking for the button on the phone as her dad woke up beside her. He often said he couldn't sleep during Jack's calls. "Okay, Jack," they both said. "All right, Mom, Dad." He paused like he was about to give orders. "We had a mission 2 nights ago. I've been shot in the right leg. Twice. They operated on me, and I'll be okay, but—" He hesitated, struggling to talk about the possibility of ending his military career. but I might limp and running will be hard. Still, I'm okay, and all my team made it back safely. "Oh, Jack," his mom exclaimed. His dad added, "Jack, as long as you're all right, where are you now?" "I'm on a ship and I should be flown home soon, I think. They might operate again or maybe not. I spoke with some people and I have a few more months with the Marines for medical care and preparing to leave. They might have office work for me, but I won't be able to." He took a few deep breaths. "I'll get a monthly payment because of my injury, but I probably can't do any jobs that require running, like being a lineman for the electric company. But I have my history degree, so I was thinking about writing or teaching. We'll see. No pressure for now. I hope it's okay if I stay at home while I figure things out." Many in the military think about what they will do if they get hurt badly. He heard his mom crying softly. There was a long pause. "Of course, you can stay," his dad said. "Just come back safe. We'll have plenty of time to talk about your future." "Yeah, I have some ideas. I think you'll like at least one of them. I'm going to leave now. It will be nice to be home. I have only been home for a few weeks in the last 4 years. It will feel good. Please let Craig and his family know. Craig is my brother who lives with his family in Wisconsin." 3 days later, I arrived at Andrews Joint Base in Maryland near Washington, D.C. My parents met me there and followed the ambulance to Quantico. They helped me to the hospital and watched as I moved around first in a wheelchair and then on crutches. They stayed with me for 5 days. I sent them home. It was great to see them, but they didn't have enough money for motels, and they knew I would be okay. I kissed them goodbye, and they flew back home. I planned to join them once I got everything sorted out. A formal request to adopt a child named Sarah Haddad came to the New Hope Child Care Agency in Washington, D.C. Several letters were sent to the agency asking that Captain Jack Leslie be considered to adopt her. Jack had written these letters before Sarah arrived in the country or was in the agency's care. He found the agency that would take care of her case before they even knew about her. Recommendations came in from people in the Navy, including a captain, a chaplain, and a nurse. All of this was filed away until Sarah arrived for their help. The agency was small, and its director had never received a request to adopt a child before the child was in her care or even known to her. Sarah was assigned to New Hope about a week after Jack Leslie sent in his letter. Jack filled out all the forms and essays that New Hope asked for. Usually this took weeks, but he hand-delivered the papers to the agency in just 3 days. Jack was assigned to MCB Quantico for the rest of his time with the Marines, exactly as he had requested. He had daily physical therapy for a few weeks, got used to using crutches quickly, and received advice on many topics beyond his work. One thing that kept him from feeling down was keeping track of Sarah Haddad. He called the agency every day to check on her after he learned she had arrived. They were curious about his interest and recorded each call. There was no sign of a family member. Their records showed she did not have immediate family and no known relatives. Who was Jack Leslie? Captain Jack Leslie? The caseworker worried about whether he might be a stalker and looked into his background. She found no one who knew him, not even his current commanding officer, who turned out to be the base commander and had never met him. He only said Jack was assigned to the U.S. Naval Hospital in Quantico. A few days later, Sarah was placed with a family in Silver Spring who had fostered several other babies in recent years. The Erlings, Errol, and Linda. A social worker named Miss Jenkins was assigned to the case, and the director warned her that healthy white infants were usually not adopted by single white men. Jenkins read all the information she had. She saw there was a strange connection between the candidate and the child, but the files didn't explain it. She knew the child was the last one left of her family, but she didn't know how that happened. When Jenkins first met Jack, it was different from what she thought it would be. At 30 years old, she had been working with state adoptions since she finished her master's degree 5 years ago. This case was unusual. A single Marine about to leave the military for health reasons wanted to adopt a certain child. They met at the BOQ on the Marine base in Quantico, which is mostly for training officers. "Jacob Leslie?" she asked when she arrived. "Yes, ma'am, but just call me Jack," he replied. "I'm Marisol Jenkins. I'll be working on Sarah Haddad's adoption. Would you like to talk here in the common room or in my room? My room is a bit like a small college dorm." he explained. "Let's go to your room, please. I need to see how you live," she said, stepping into the entrance and noticing Jack using crutches. "I didn't know you were on crutches," she remarked. "Yeah, I hurt my leg. I'm on this floor, so please follow me. I'm still getting used to these," he said. When they got to his room, he opened the door. Inside, there were a few chairs around a table, a bed, and a bathroom. "I'll move back in with my parents in Ohio after I leave the military and the adoption goes through," Jack explained. "I'm here now because I need therapy for my leg. Luckily, Sarah is just 30 miles away." They sat at the little table, and Jack was calm, even though he was a bit nervous. Jenkins asked him how he hurt his leg. "It wasn't top secret or anything, but it happened while I was on a mission in the Middle East and I got shot. That's how I met Sarah. I named her, actually." "What?" Jenkins said, surprised. The files only mentioned that the child had no living relatives and no possessions. She glanced at the birth certificate, which said she was born in southern Syria. "They don't tell you these things?" Jack asked with a smile. "Can I offer you coffee or tea? Or maybe a Coke? I have regular and diet." "I can get it myself. Don't move," she replied with a smile. "What would you like?" "Diet Coke, please. I haven't been active much in the last few weeks." As Jenkins got the drinks from the small fridge, Jack started to share his story. 4 weeks ago, I was part of a team sent to southern Syria to help an American family. They were hiding there and were in serious danger from some local groups. The family included 4 kids and the mother, Sarah Gillespie, from Dearborn, Michigan. I don't know much about her husband's background, but I do know he was Syrian and not a strict Muslim. "Are you sure you want to hear this?" he asked her. She looked younger than her actual age, even though she was a few years older than he was. She nodded and took a sip of her Coke. "Anyway, we found their small house. Both parents were shot in the head. We looked for their children, 3 boys and a baby. We discovered 2 of the boys dead in the outhouse, and the oldest boy, around 8 years old, was dead on the other side of a small hill about 150 feet from the house. We knew about the baby, but we couldn't find her. Our helicopter arrived, ready to take us away, but I couldn't stop thinking about leaving a child, an American one, behind. That would mean she would likely not survive." Jack sipped his Coke. "I thought about the parents, Sarah and Adnan Haddad. They must have seen the danger coming. They put the kids out the back window and told them to run. The parents stayed behind, hoping the danger would only take them, or that they could talk their way out. I imagined that the oldest boy, who could carry her, took the baby and tried to hide her. But we didn't find her in the dark. Just as I was about to get on the helicopter, a firefight started. I thought I knew where to search, so I told the team to leave, thinking I knew where the child might be. They took off. The pilot probably didn't realize I wasn't on board, but with the shooting from the north, he had to get airborne. I ran to the south, then hid and crawled up the hill behind the house. I reached the spot where the oldest boy had fallen. I felt around for an hour without a light, afraid there might be enemies nearby. I had night vision gear, which helped. But it's hard to see clearly until something moves. You stayed behind when your whole team left, just because you thought you might find the missing child? She could have been anywhere, Marisol asked. Jack shifted his leg to avoid a cramp. He took another sip and nodded. "You found Sarah?" Jenkins asked. This was definitely an unusual adult-child reunion she'd heard about. "After about an hour and a half, yes. I heard her. She was hiding in a spot that a child might choose during a game of hide-and-seek. That's my little romantic twist. Maybe it was the boy's favorite hiding place. She was between 2 big rocks in a dip with a cloth in her mouth, crying softly when I found her. I couldn't see her in the dark, and I wouldn't have fit in there, so I gently pulled her out. That was how I met her." He took another sip and smiled at Jenkins. "How did you escape?" she asked. "I had a satellite phone. I called in and told them I had the child and she was alive. I heard the captain on the other end say, 'He found her and she's alive,' and everyone cheered. They said they would send a helicopter after dark the next night, but I had to stay hidden until then. They gave me coordinates about a kilometer away." She interrupted him. "A click? Kilometer? It usually took about 15 minutes to walk. I had to get through the day somehow. I didn't know much about taking care of babies. I had 2 packets of coffee creamer and some food with me. The baby had only drank a little, so I mixed the creamer with water. I soaked a piece of cloth I had torn from my shirt in the mixture and let her suck it while I held my finger there. It worked, but she cried a bit, so we were lucky no one heard us. I tickled her and gently blew on her tummy, trying to make her laugh instead of cry. She smiled a few times and mostly just slept. I named her Sarah after her mother, and her last name is Haddad. I needed to call her something to make her feel real to me, not just a kid. I remember she still had part of her umbilical cord. She had 2 dirty diapers and I had no other ones, so I cleaned her up on a rock and let it dry in the sun. I didn't want to go to the well by the house. Later, when she got wet again, I took off her diaper to let her dry. Things dry quickly in the hot Syrian desert. It was over 90 degrees. Thank goodness she slept for most of the afternoon. A few times I heard people nearby, and I was scared that Sarah would cry. When it was getting dark, I took us to the top of a nearby hill where I could see the field, so we were further away from the house. He took a big sip of his Coke. The helicopter arrived just on time as I reached the field carrying her in my left arm, but when the helicopter landed, gunfire started from the hill we had just left, maybe about 400 meters away. It wasn't too close, but then a rocket flew by us as we were running toward the helicopter, so some of them must have been right behind us. RPG? Jenkins asked. Rocket-propelled grenade. It's not a long-range weapon. It missed the helicopter, or we might still be there. Just when I got to the helicopter, I was hit twice in my right leg. The shot in my thigh ended my military career, and the other one was just for added trouble. I was able to pass Sarah to my teammate, and he helped me get into the helicopter because I collapsed. He became quiet, thinking about that night. When I realized that was my last mission, I started thinking about my purpose. All I could think about was that there was a child who needed a family, and even though I was single, I really wanted that. I knew I could care for a child if I became a teacher or a writer. My parents are great-grandparents to my brother's kids, but they live far away, and Sarah would never lack support at home. I felt love for her, or something like it. I had been focused on finding her. It felt like it was meant to happen, like she was my last mission for a reason. "Do you believe in God?" Jenkins asked. Jack thought back to that day and night, falling to protect her from a rock, promising her he would do everything he could to keep her safe. He remembered thinking and saying, "God help us." "Yes, but I'm not a very devoted Catholic. Does that help or hurt my chances?" Anyway, I don't think God plans things this way. I think it was just many things coming together. At best, this was a sad event, but there was one big happiness. Jenkins smiled. Her story was different. She often felt uncertain about single-parent adoptions because life can get complicated, and adoption is for life. When another child comes along or a new partner, it can get tougher. She had seen how pets could upset family life. She had never met a man who wanted to be a single parent. Leslie's records showed nothing unfit for parenting. The only odd thing was that he was still single. She wondered about his personal life. Did women come and go in his apartment when he was away? "Do you have a girlfriend, Jack?" she asked. He shook his head. "I was engaged once. Unfortunately, she didn't feel the same. I haven't dated much since then. I joined the Marines. I spent years at training schools. I went to TBS and IOC here, then swapped places with an Israeli guy. He went to SEAL school and I went to theirs. Then I joined a small SEAL unit even though I'm a Marine. I was with them for a few months when this whole thing happened." He patted his leg. "I went on a few dates, one girl twice, over 5 years or so. Nothing serious came from it. But if this adoption works out, it would make everything worth it." "Have you seen Sarah?" Jack asked. "No, I haven't. She's with a foster family in Maryland. That's just temporary, you know. They don't have any long-term claim because she's in foster care." She sounded almost sorry as she realized why. One man had put his life on the line, actually choosing to stay instead of running away, protected her from danger, faced a tough enemy, hurt his leg, declared his feelings, and wanted to make Sarah, just Sarah, his own child. Yet others had a fair chance too? Is it any wonder he cared for the girl? He had risked everything to find her alive. She compared it to the risk a couple takes when they decide to have a baby. There's always a chance something could go wrong, like health issues or loss. Couples take that risk. Parents do too. Leslie took that step without knowing if he could care for the child. They are not looking to adopt her. They have cared for several babies. What will you do if you don't get her? She asked. It would be the worst pain of my life, worse than leaving the Corps. I didn't choose how I feel. I was alone with her. We could hear the people who hurt her family. We had only each other. They were so close. Right there. I know it's different for her since she won't remember any of this, but it mattered to me, and we formed a bond. I don't want a life without her. He paused for a moment, and she thought he was lost in deep thoughts. I'm sorry for not answering your question. I want to keep going, but some people live with a heavy sadness, like losing someone they loved or facing a big change. There's a line in a song, "Without a hurt, the heart is empty." But mine is full. I'll probably teach high school when I get back home, or maybe I'll write. I've always wanted to write, but I thought I needed to see more of life first. Maybe that's a silly idea. She didn't think it was silly at all. She felt the strong feelings he had about the child. Do you have a degree in history? She asked. Yes, ma'am. I can teach as a student and take one more class to get my teaching license for secondary education in Ohio. I think getting a master's degree in history would be interesting and useful no matter what I do. How would you take care of a child with all this going on? He smiled. I have enough money for more schooling. I listed my savings on the application, along with my last tax return. I've saved most of my money from the last 4 years. I don't have a car. I've lived on military bases, and I haven't gone home much, so my costs have been low. I could manage for years of full-time school without any income. I could pay for daycare if needed, but I'd rather family or I take care of her. My parents are healthy and in their early 50s. They would love to have a grandchild close by. And who knows, maybe there's someone special in my future. She looked at him. He was tall, fit, and had a strong look, with a handsome square jaw and deep-set eyes. He had laugh lines around his eyes, which seemed unexpected for someone who looked so serious as a military man. His hair was dark, but he wasn't from the Middle East. Would you tell Sarah she was adopted? She asked. Of course. Her family died to keep her safe, and that's something she needs to know. Her brother, he started, then paused, and she noticed tears welling in his eyes. I would tell her first that I adopted her because I loved her, since her parents couldn't be with us. When she was older, I'd share more details. I would tell her everything, or write it down for her. She should know the truth before anyone else tells her. Their deaths were both brave and sad. Have you shared your plans to adopt with your parents? He shook his head with a smile. Not yet, but they would be shocked if it happens. My mom would love the idea, but if I couldn't adopt, it would break her heart. You mentioned there would be a home study since I plan to stay there for a while. I hope that can happen after the adoption at home. I want to take Sarah to surprise them. She smiled back. The situation was different. He was just passing through, and a home visit didn't really fit for a man living with his parents for a few months. They could work around it if the adoption happened before he returned home. The home study was more about understanding the adoption than the physical home itself. Questions arose about how Sarah's siblings felt, if the living situation was good, and if there were any hidden issues within the family. That would be a happy moment. It was 2 months before Leslie got the green light to adopt Sarah Haddad. There seemed to be no interest from her father's family, either in America or Syria. In fact, they couldn't be found. Mr. Aglai confirmed that Adnan had not talked to his family in years because he married a Christian and rejected some of the strict beliefs that were common where they lived. The adoption officials thought that looking for family members was not needed due to the family conflicts stemming from politics and religion. They believed that Adnan's marriage and choices showed what he wanted for Sarah. There were positive letters from the chaplain and captain of the baton about Leslie, praising his wish to care for Sarah. Miss Jenkins recommended that the adoption be approved, with the requirement that a home study take place within a month after they moved to Ohio to make sure everything was in order. A week before the final hearing, Leslie met Sarah's foster parents, Linda and Errol Erling, in a conference room at the courthouse. They were surprised to see a big Marine in casual clothes as the man hoping to adopt Sarah, who had been with them for the past 7 weeks. They only knew that Sarah was Syrian, that her family had passed away, and that there had been a request to adopt her. Leslie arrived after the Erlings and approached their table, walking with a limp. He extended his hand to Errol. "Mr. Erling? They said you were the one to meet? I'm Jack Leslie." Errol stood up to shake Leslie's hand, surprised by his size and that he wanted to be a parent to Sarah. "Yes, sir. I'm Errol. We've been caring for Sarah for over a month now. She's such a sweet girl." Leslie then looked at Linda, Errol's wife. Her expression was serious and a bit cold. He sensed her strong feelings for Sarah. She was protective and skeptical. "Mr. Leslie," Mrs. Erling said. She stood up and shook his hand, but kept her thoughts to herself. To Linda, Sarah was special and needed to be kept safe. She gazed at Leslie, clearly wondering about him. "Hello? I want you to know," Leslie said, "I appreciate everything you've done for her. She has lost so much. People who cared for her. I hope to provide her with the love she needs, but she needs to feel that love first." Jack paused, realizing this was just an introduction. He didn't need to prove himself anymore, but he knew these foster parents had truly cared for Sarah. They needed to understand that he was aware of Sarah's deep need for love and security. Mrs. Erling studied the man sitting across from her. "Mr. Leslie? Why do you want to adopt our Sarah?" "Just call me Jack," he replied. Leslie looked at him, this man in his 30s who had cared for many infants. She wondered what drove him. As he stood across the table from her, he thought back to his meeting with the Navy officers about joining the SEALs. "I'm just an ordinary guy without money, fame, or power," he said, pausing to gather his thoughts. He looked down and then back up at Linda. "But I'm the one who rescued her from Syria. I found her when everyone else was leaving. I kept her safe for 26 hours, just steps away from those who hurt her family. I used cloth and coffee creamer to feed her and protected her from danger. I handed her to the SEALs who got her to safety, and I was shot twice during that time. I care for her just like you do." Jack leaned on the table, speaking with honesty, not as a threat. "I believe you would have done the same for her. Nobody loves her like we do, you and I. That's who I am." He understood what she wanted to know. She was asking if he cared for Sarah like a good parent should. He looked at Linda, and she met his gaze without flinching. The custody transfer happened at a courthouse in front of a judge, who was surprised to see a Marine adopting a child alone. Ms. Jenkins stood up. "Your Honor, may I say something?" "Of course. You were the social worker who met with Captain Leslie 3 times. "Yes, ma'am. He also came to adoption group meetings twice a week for 6 weeks, she said. "This case is different because of how he connected with the child. We believe we followed the right steps, but it wasn't like most adoptions. Everything moved quickly. There will still be a follow-up study in Ohio by Ohio Adoption Services when Mr. Leslie moves there soon." "Is there a report about that?" the judge asked. "Yes, it's in the first paperwork from my office," Jenkins replied. "We treated Captain Leslie as if he were family." The judge read for a moment. Then she stood, walked around her desk, and extended her hand to him. "This is quite remarkable," she said as he shook her hand. "It looks like you applied for adoption before Sarah even arrived here. You've already formed a bond with her. Why would we want to stop that bond from growing?" The judge checked more documents. "How did you learn which agency Sarah would join?" Jack stood tall. "Captain Miller of the Baton kept me updated about everything once I told him I wanted to adopt. He was able to track down the people who were responsible for her. The choice to place her with this agency was made by someone at the State Department, the ones who gave her a birth certificate and passport. That's impressive." The magistrate signaled to her assistant, who opened the door, letting the Erlings bring Sarah into the room. She had grown. Jack hadn't seen her in months since the ship. Yet it was her, with darker and thicker eyebrows, her hair nearly gone. "What happened to her hair?" he asked Linda, who smiled and replied, "It disappeared." Everyone was smiling now, and the tension from before had vanished. Jack felt he was about to become a father in a beautiful way. The magistrate looked at the child in the foster mother's arms and grinned. "Linda Erling, you may hand the child over to Jacob Leslie, the person you spoke to earlier," she said. Linda walked to Jack and handed him the child. "Oh, and the baby bag. We put a special gift in there for you both, and my husband will carry a bag of clothes and things for you. Good luck, Jack." "Linda, I really don't know what to say. I have something for you, too," Jack said as he held Sarah carefully and nodded towards a small wrapped gift and a card on the table. "Thank you." Captain Leslie, you are now the father of Sarah Haddad Leslie. If you could sign these papers, everything will be official. Jack moved forward, no longer using crutches, handed Sarah to the judge, and quickly signed the papers. The judge didn't notice any change in the new father's expression, but Jack couldn't find the words. He saw the judge waiting for him to speak, but he could only shake his head. They spent the last week before his separation at a motel in Dumfries, Virginia, waiting for his paperwork. He took Sarah, who he decided to call Hattie, as a way to remember her mother and family, everywhere he went. He bought a car seat that he could use on an airplane, learned to tie pink ribbons around her hairless head, and took her to restaurants, placing her in her seat on the chairs. He even took her to meet his commanding officer, the base commander. At first, the commander was shocked and a bit upset about Jack bringing a baby, but once he understood the situation, he insisted on holding her. With no duties to attend to, Jack just waited for his paperwork, which he received the day after meeting the commander. He wondered if their meeting had helped with that. Suddenly, he was Captain Jacob Leslie, USMC, Rhett. It felt like a part of him had disappeared. But no life is complete with just one dream. When one dream ends or seems out of reach, most people find another. Jack had his daughter to raise, school to attend, classes to teach, and books to write. At 4 o'clock the next day, on a cold but clear winter day, Leslie's cab pulled up in front of his old home in Sky Gray, Ohio. The driver took out his 2 bags as Leslie removed her child from the car in a new seat. He thanked the driver for bringing the bags to the porch and set the car seat down while giving the driver a tip. "Good luck, buddy. I'm glad your leg's getting better." "Thanks." Jack took little Sarah out and knocked on the door as the driver walked away. The door was open. It was never locked during the day. "Mom! Dad!" he called out. They came quickly, and when they saw him with Sarah in her heavy winter coat, it was clear they were surprised. "Jack? Jack?" "Mom," he said softly, "this is your granddaughter, Hattie. I adopted her." It felt like magic. His parents had so many questions, but Hattie was in his mother's arms in an instant, crying because she didn't understand the new faces and smells and so much love. Mom started to cry too, realizing this was real, trying to take off the coat awkwardly. Dad made a huffing sound, which was his way of hiding his feelings. Dad wanted to say something but was too shocked. He hugged Jack tightly. "She's about 5 months old. The date on the birth certificate is just a guess, but we think it's close," Jack said, sitting down at the kitchen table as the surprise settled in. "How did you adopt a child? Why didn't you tell us?" his mother asked as she walked around the room, holding Sarah close, who was still crying. "It's a long story and it's not all good. Are you sure you want to hear it?" Jack asked, knowing they would want to know everything. Love means sharing the truth, even if it's hard. "Yes, we want to know," his father said. "Who wouldn't want to know?" "Let me grab our things," Jack said. He walked back to the porch and brought in the baby bag, his other bags, and the car seat. Then he mixed some formula and handed the bottle to his mother. Jack began to tell them about his time on the mission, how he found her parents who had been killed, and how he stayed back when the first rescue helicopter came. He shared how he discovered her, recounting the sad story of her 2 brothers who had died. One brother had hidden her before he passed away, and Jack found her by reaching in the dark. Finally, he spoke of hiding out for a day, trying to keep her quiet and happy, and how he was picked up during a firefight and got hurt. "Her first name is Sarah, but I kept her family name as her middle name, Haddad. I want to call her Hattie, so her family is always part of her." His dad huffed again. Jack hadn't seen his father do that much when he lived at home. It was a new habit, but it seemed to fit him well. Extraordinary, brave. "People can be really good when they love," Jack's dad said softly. "Yeah," Jack replied. "You too," Dad added. "Harumph," Jack grumbled. They both laughed softly. "So she's Syrian?" Jack's mom asked as she played with her granddaughter. "Her mom is from Michigan. She's an orphan, so that makes her American too. Her dad was an engineer who met her mom at the University of Michigan. They moved to Syria to help build water systems in the desert. Things got dangerous over there, so when we found out, we sent my team to help." "Your team?" his mom said, surprised. He had never told them about his work. "I was a leader in a SEAL team, Mom," Jack explained. His dad understood what that meant. "I trained for a long time, including some special training in Israel." I learned to jump from planes, scuba dive, and handle explosives. I was always going into different places to rescue people or deal with bad guys. There are more groups involved in the fighting than most people know. It was a lot of work, and I found my daughter during my last mission. His mom sat down, cooing at her hungry grandchild. Jack knew she wouldn't give up on the baby easily. "Those brows! She is so beautiful!" his mom exclaimed. Mom, a lot of Syrians have dark brows and some have blue eyes." "But kids' eyes can change color," she said, finishing his thought. This was how his mom showed love. She would notice little things about children, like a kneecap or a birthmark, and she loved them for it. She didn't mind a bit of mess if the baby was happy. Right now, Sarah was happily drinking from her bottle. "Why didn't you tell us?" his dad asked. "I was worried you might not support the adoption, so I kept it a secret." "I didn't want you to feel sad if it didn't work out," Jack explained. "What about baptism? Has she been baptized?" his dad questioned. Jack shook his head. He knew nothing about that. They only found the bodies and no papers. Maybe her mom did it because it was dangerous. "I'll speak to Father and see what he thinks," Jack said. "She got some vaccinations before they let her leave Andrews, but I'll take her to the doctor soon. There's so much to do. Being a dad means keeping track of everything." His parents chuckled, and for the first time, Sarah smiled in her grandma's arms. "We should call Craig," Jack said. Craig, his older brother, lived in Wisconsin and had a wife and 2 kids Jack had only seen a few times. The kids should be 5 and 3, both boys, Jack thought. His mom gave Hattie to her husband. "Here, hold your new grandchild." She picked up the phone before he could respond. "Lisa, hi, this is Mom Leslie. We have some great news." "Yes, he's home. He walks with a limp, but he has a daughter. She's 5 months old. They adopted her." His mom put her hand over the phone and said, "I can hear her calling for Craig." "Yes." "Craig? Yeah, he adopted a girl. It's quite a story. I'll send you an email with all the details." "Yes. Yeah, here he is." She handed the phone to Jack. Leslie took the phone. "Hello, Craig. A lot has changed in my life, huh?" Craig replied, "You adopted a girl? I thought you would leave the Marines after your injury, but..." "Yeah, but it felt right. Mom will write you. But Craig, I might want to call you." "Any time, Yacker. A kid! I never thought you would have a kid, not after what Janice did." "That's just the past, my friend. I learned from it." "What's her name?" "I named her after her parents, who died in Syria. Sarah Haddad Leslie. Call her Hattie. I can't wait for you to meet her." "Easter, Yacker. We'll see her then. Love you, kiddo." "Love you too, Craig. Give Lisa and the kids a hug from me." "I will. Yacker, I'm proud of you." Click. Yacker was his childhood nickname, a shorter form of Yaakov, which is Hebrew for Jacob. His big brother made it up because he said Jack talked a lot. Hattie was asleep in his mom's arms. They all sat around and chatted until 10 that night, sharing stories about people Jack knew and what had happened over the years. Janice had moved away. Marge said she had her baby but then stopped joining the church meetings and seemed to pull away from everyone. Jack's mom didn't know anything about Janice, Kevin, or their child, not for a long time. Hattie looked at the government and the family diners. She had one more paragraph to finish her essay, but she didn't read it. She changed it just a bit and said it out loud. This usually shy little girl said, "Some of my friends worry if their dads love them. I have never wondered that. My birth parents and my brother Rifat gave someone a chance to love me. My adoptive father found me, showing me my parents' love for me." And here she almost whispered as her feelings caught up with her. "And he has loved me ever since." The audience erupted in applause and stood up. Hattie looked down, and Jack noticed she was in her shy fog. Jack felt his mother behind him on his right, holding Laisha's hand, and his father behind him on the left. He heard a little sob. Maybe from his mom? His father squeezed his left arm. "You have quite a kid," his father said. Everyone was standing. General Meyer was looking at Jack, smiling slightly while clapping. He realized that he had been saved that night, just like Hattie. He had been helped by Sarah Gillespie, a woman who passed away before he could meet her, and Adnan Haddad, a kind man in a tough world. They gave him a chance to care for their child. Laisha, holding Jack's right hand, looked into his eyes and said, "Save one love, save the world." He smiled and replied, "I think you changed that a bit. I'm pretty sure it's different in the Talmud." I want to be part of your family, Jack, she said earnestly. He smiled back at her, looking deeply into her eyes. I was hoping you would. Is that a promise? She returned his smile and said, Yes, it is. I agree, but with one condition, he said, his expression serious. Laisha stared at him, curious about what that would be. You must become a parent to my daughter. Her smile widened. I love you, and I accept your condition. Hey audience, if you liked this video and want to keep up with more thrilling stories, make sure to subscribe to Prince Cheating Tales and hit the notification bell. You don't want to miss out on our upcoming adventures. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next wonderful story.